Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Son of a Blitch podcast. I'm your host, George Blitch. Today, I'm with a very special guest, Jason Garvey, who is a man of many talents. I first came to know Jason through various interactions on the Texas Hunting Forum, where I came to view him as a resident expert on long-range shooting, rifle training, reloading, and also building some amazing custom rifles. Jason has also worked as a firefighter and paramedic for the last 21 years and is currently with the Richardson Fire Department here in Texas. Jason, thank you for your tireless efforts as a first responder, and thank you for joining me today. I'd like to begin with you telling me a little bit about your business, Precision Rifle Hunters.
Well, thank you for having me. This all started all the way back to as a teenager, which was a long time ago. And around Collin County, Texas, a friend of mine, he raised cattle, and he had leased land as well as owned land that he ran a pretty good sized herd. And he and I both were coyote hunting. You know, typically Friday night, Saturday night, you know, we would often be in the bed of a truck with a red light and a 22-250 and calling in coyotes. And, you know, with a 22-250, a 200-yard shot's really easy. And I later wanted to learn how to hit that coyote as far as I could see it in the daytime. And I searched the internet and talked to people and tried to read and watch as many videos and absorb as much as I could. And a lot of this still did not make sense, because to put this all together, there is a lot to it to get all your pieces to work in concert on a precision rifle with a good optic. And I've told a lot of people that have come out to my range with me that about 2 years is how long it took me to just figure this all out. You know, I bought the wrong rifle, I bought the wrong scope, base rings, and you know, there's a lot of smart people that post on forums, and you know, you've got to figure out who to ignore and who to pay attention to. And fortunately, I knew the guys that when I'm reading what they're writing, who to pay attention to. They knew what they were doing. And basically 2 years is how long it took me with the wrong equipment and then switching equipment in between. And it was a big deal the first day that I got a fairly accurate shot on paper at 500 yards. And I had friends that had leased property outside of Blue Ridge, Texas, that allowed me to go use the land. And it was farmland. And I'd have to, you know, four-wheeler, take targets with me, set them up, laser back to my truck with a rangefinder, and start learning, get a dope chart. Dope is an acronym. I didn't come up with this. I've learned all this. Data on previous engagement. So that is, you physically have to shoot at every distance, document your findings in elevation mostly, then of course in wind hold, which we'll get into that later. But I just had to figure this out on my own, and, you know, kind of made some friends with some guys that had more experience, and they helped me along. And then the day I hit a piece of steel 1,000 yards, that was also a big deal. Yeah. And then I got better equipment, you know, rifle and scope and base and rings, and found out very early in this process that factory ammo is just not going to cut it. And this was around 2010. The 6.5 Creedmoor wasn't mainstream at the time. Back then, even at rifle matches, you still saw 260 Remington. I bought a Savage, what they call their military and police version in 308. And that's the first thing I learned to hand load with, was a 308 Winchester, which is actually still today one of the easiest to load and shoot, and it's never going to go away. It came out in 1952, still extremely popular. I think it always will be. But I rebarreled it to 260 Remington and learned to hand load that, just because it does give you a little bit of an edge in the wind at distance. And the precision rifle series didn't exist then, and there were guys that had ranges all over the country, and of course a whole lot of them in Texas. And via the website Sniper's Hide, there were guys advertising matches that they were hosting, and I started shooting in those and found out really quickly that those type of rifle matches that is now the Precision Rifle Series is great for hunters, because, you know, they've got us shooting really far and really precise, and also at least half the stages you'll be shooting what's called positional shooting. So you're not on a bench ever. If we're shooting prone, it's probably a really far shot, small targets, and they're probably hoping it's really windy. But positional, is getting off prone, getting away from the bench, which is exactly what hunters have to do. Any hunter that hunts with a rifle across the globe, he's got to shoot off of his backpack, just him and his rifle, just his body only, the tree limb, the barbed wire fence, you know, just whatever he's got available, or she, to get the rifle be stable. And, you know, I've told people the guys that do well at those matches, there's two key things, because everyone's got good equipment. Everyone's shown up for the most part with really, really well-made rifles, really good rifle scopes. They're all hand-loaded for. But when you take away the equipment and you just go to the skill set of the people that do really well, they can keep the rifle still and they can read wind and properly allow for it. And I learned a lot from the more experienced guys there, and then said, you know, back to coyote hunting, I've seen them at all distances you can possibly come up with. And if you're out in the field, you've got to use what's available to you to get the rifle supported, get out of foliage. Terrain features can make it where you can't see if you're low to the ground.
Sure.
You know, I've killed some with my rifle resting on a tree limb, and I'm completely standing up because I couldn't go lower. And then I got better as a hunter. I got more hits on coyotes and hogs, because in Texas and much of the southeast and southwest of the United States, there's a feral hog problem. So it helped me a lot in getting those field position shooting stable and can still shoot some distance. And I thought, you know, there's people out there that want to learn a couple of things. They want to learn how to put this whole system together with rifle, optic, ammo, and they also want to learn how to shoot better. And, you know, I learned it and felt like there would probably be a market for other people wanting to come learn as well. So I bought land, I built a range, and began offering private one-on-one lessons, and really clarifying a lot of things that people like me, they were reading and they just got confused. And quite frankly, a lot of people show up and they've made this harder than it really is. And I would rather they don't read a thing. Just come out and let me make this make sense, and we'll physically shoot it out to distance several times. And you'll leave understanding how to make this happen without me beside you. So there's where the company name Precision Rifle Hunters came in, because when you get your equipment squared away, and then learn how to operate it correctly, you're basically more dangerous when you're going hunting, whatever animal is your choice. And a whole lot of my customers have been former East Texas guys that decided to take off west of I-35, and the distances get longer and you can see farther. And especially if you want to go get a pronghorn, you kind of need to be able to shoot far. And they just don't know how to make it happen. And that's what I'm here for, is to make this all make sense and shoot it on a good square range in a controlled environment. And we'll go at your pace. And I'm not going to rush anyone. I've got a dry erase board. I've got a list I go down. And that was what I did for years, and that was all I did. And then later, I had a friend tell me, man, there's guys that need scopes mounted and zeroed. There's going to be guys that want custom load development for their rifles because they're tired of mediocre ammo in a really good rifle. They want really good ammo in a really good rifle. So in order to legally, according to the ATF, according to them, to take in someone's rifle and do anything to it, whether it be just mount a scope and zero it for them, or keep it for, you know, days or weeks and do a load development, make ammo, I've got to have a federal firearms license. So I added that. And that's been the bulk of the reason for getting that, was so I can take your rifle, do a load development like it was my own, and get the rifle to shoot as good as it can shoot, and then give it back to the person that owns it, you know. So that's where there was a weak link in equipment for everyone, including myself. I've been there buying ammo, and I just said, you know, I can help people even farther. And it's been extremely gratifying to have people that they came back, they got the rifle, and they took off on a hunt in 2 weeks or 2 months later, and they're texting me photos of dead elk, and one guy's killed several moose, and you know, lots of whitetail and mule deer, and I'm glad I could help them. You know, taught them how to shoot a little better, taught them how to shoot farther, and made their ammo for them later a lot of times. So it's just making this all get more precise, and we're trying to get to the goal for everyone is your equipment is not the problem. If you practice and you learn how, you'll learn your limitations. You'll learn a shot distance that you should say, you know what, I'm going to try to close in a little tighter. Or if you can't close and you need to shoot farther, at least you know how to do it. It's a tool in the toolbox.
Sure.
So
sure.
that's where the company name came from, and blending, going from coyote hunter only to shooting competition and learning from experienced people there, and then take that same knowledge and put it back into hunting.
So I do want to touch base on the competitions, because a lot of folks might not realize what happens at some of these matches. Can you walk me through kind of a long distance, rifle, setup? Like, what is happening when someone's showing up? What are some of the kinds of stages that you may be going through? And just kind of explain that, because that might not be, a lot of people are hunters, might not know anything about matches and what that accounts to.
Okay. So, you'll typically, it'll be a weekend because most people work, Monday through Friday. If it's a 2-day big match, and that's usually the ones I like to shoot because I've got to travel. So if I've got to travel, I want to shoot for Saturday and Sunday. But you'll show up Friday, you'll sign in, you'll check your zero. If you're smart, you check your zero wherever your home range is, the one you use closest to home. But when you change locations, you do need to adjust your zero potentially by changing locations on a drastic change. I've traveled 500 miles from home, and my zero shifted. So you check your zero, they've got it there available for you. And some places, that's it. You signed in, you check your zero, you're assigned a squad, and they'll either have those squads numbered or lettered. And what they evolved into later in the precision rifle series existing is randomly squatting people. And one match that went on for years was up in Northwest Oklahoma, called the Heat Stroke Open. And it's about the 3rd week of July. There's no shade trees out there, and that's real similar to Texas Panhandle type terrain. It's canyons and sand, and it is a really, really difficult match because it's exactly like Texas Panhandle wind. We've seen 30-mile-an-hour wind speeds up there. And the random squatting, what they were doing, it's actually very, very smart. They're forcing you to meet new people. And when you go to Northwest Oklahoma from, in my case, North Texas, I've shot with people from Kansas, the Dakotas, Illinois, Oklahoma guys, a couple Texas guys, of course, but you'd meet more people from other states. And, they're like-minded. They're just out here to have fun and shoot far, and you have a great time, and you kind of make friends, and the community is very helpful to each other. If a new guy shows up and he says, I'm a new guy, they will intentionally put you with a known, experienced person, and that experienced person will help the new person. And no one wants to beat you because your equipment failed. If you've got a magazine failure, a feed, somebody's going to hand you a magazine and just give it back before you go home. That's just the community, and it's really good that it's that way. So
a lot of camaraderie.
That's why I was fortunate. I'm sorry.
I said a lot of camaraderie, it seems like. That's great.
Absolutely. But as far as the stages go, you'll usually be handed a match book on Friday when you sign in, and they'll have the stages, and in each stage will have every distance you're going to shoot. Typically, there's not what's called a UKD, unknown distance. That they might throw one of those in there out of potentially 50 stages for 2 days. Most stages you have known distances. They gave you the distances. They gave you target shape, target size, target color. They will give you a par time. You cannot exceed this time and continue shooting. Some of them are 1 minute, some are 90 seconds, some are 2 minutes. But it could be a 10-shot stage. And you can potentially have between, 3 distances you've got to engage up to 8 or 9. And they may change your shot angle throughout the same stage. And it gets very, very mental. You've got to organize all this in your head, and you've got to shoot the targets in the correct order that's on the stage description. And I've had stages that literally the targets were scattered out across 180 degrees of a field of fire. So obviously these are on huge pieces of private property where you can safely shoot distance, and distances are going to vary, anywhere from 200 yards to farthest I've personally seen has been 1,300 yards with your rifle, and everything in between. And the reason for changing that shot angle is because your wind speed and direction are holding, but now you're shooting different angles. So you've got to know how to manage that wind that's crossing at different angles from your shot angle. And it is really challenging. You know, I've done it. I've zeroed stages. I missed every single attempt I was making just because I was wrong about the wind hold. Everyone's done it. When, you know, guys out there say he cleaned it, if it was 10 targets and you made 10 shots and hit every one of them, you cleaned it. You didn't have a single miss. It's a great feeling. You're up against yourself mostly. And a lot of those will be positional. I've shot off an old pickup sitting out in the pasture. I've shot off a pile of boulders. There's times, of course, we'll go prone. You're liable to be on the dirt. Sometimes they'll have us move and shoot. You know, you've got to maybe make a couple shots from one position and then travel 20 to 30 yards, take a new position, potentially a new target, move again and move and shoot. And when you're pushed to that level of having to shoot accurately and quickly, once you get out of hunting and things are slowed down a little bit, and maybe you're doing an ambush style hunting that so many people do, and you've got a little bit more time, it's not as difficult once you've been pushed to that level of difficulty shooting those matches. Everyone will run a stage. When everyone in your squad has shot that stage, all of you as a group will travel to the next stage. And you've got a whole new course of fire you've got to look up. And oftentimes you've got to have some kind of what is actually referred to as an observation optic, which would be a spotting scope or binoculars. You've got to locate your targets out there in the field because sometimes they're kind of hidden. And you've got to actually find them and make a mental map in your head and what order you've got to travel in your optic to go find them when you're actually shooting. What else is also another difficulty? You'll always have two range officers at a stage. One will be on his own binocular or spotting scope. Another will be sitting beside him or her, and they're keeping score. And if you miss, no one says a word. It is your job to spot for yourself. So if you fire a shot, you have to see it arrive either on target or what we call a splash. That's where the dirt puffs up, and then quickly make a correction. If you hit your target, range officer says impact, and that's it. No one's going to spot for you. You've got to do it on your own. So that helped me teaching people how to shoot better. If you're intentionally trying to see your bullet arrive, whether it be on a piece of steel or on an animal, the process of that is going to make you physically shoot better if you're trying to be your own spotter. And tens of thousands of rounds I've fired, and I finally developed the ability to not blink when I shoot. And that is because I'm trying to spot for myself. And obviously customers' rifles, there's some lightweight ones that come through with a big cartridge, and it's really difficult to spot for myself, but others, it's not bad. And I can see them get down range and know what either went well or went bad. So that's why I learned that, was because it was set up ahead of me, and this is what I was kind of forced to do. So you either adapt and try to stay in the match, or don't come do this anymore. Either one.
Right. So walk me through when someone is coming to you, like, you know, hunting season's coming up. Someone says, hey, I want to become a better shooter. They've brought in their equipment. What are you doing as far as checking their equipment? And then what are you doing as far as checking that particular shooter to kind of start out the day? Like what is, you know, stage one, what are you doing?
So, you know, stage one is actually on the phone or text message or email. And, you know, they say, I want to come out, I want to learn how to do this. And then I immediately, the next thing I have is tell me what rifle you have, tell me your base rings and scope and what ammo. Some guys are already hand loaders that come out, and, you know, they potentially punch paper to 100, 200 yards, and they're already hand loaders. That's great, because typically that's way better ammo than mass production ammo is ever going to be. I've had a lot of people, you know, they tell me what they have, and I've told them, your rifle and your ammo can probably do this, but your rifle scope cannot. And a couple of different things has happened. I've told a lot of people, you can borrow one of mine. We'll pull my scope off of my rifle. We'll put it on yours. We'll clamp it down, zero my scope to your rifle, and off we will go. There's been other times when I've told people, when your scope is incapable of going all the way down my range, and they've asked me, well, then I'll buy what's necessary. And my next question for their question is what's your budget? And, you know, if someone says $1,000, well, I'm gonna fire them some links to some rifle scopes that will get this done for under $1,000. Some have said 1,500. Some have said, I don't care what it costs. Well, okay, then I'll give you I don't care what it costs rifle scope option. As far as the rifle goes, make sure all the screws are tight. You know, I typically do that. And, you know, whether you drop a rifle off to me or you showed up and you're going to shoot it, let's verify that every screw on that thing is tight with a torque wrench in inch pounds. Action screws torque down, make sure the barrel's not touching the stock forearm, make sure whatever scope base they have is tight, check their ring tightness. And as far as their equipment check, that's what happens first. Some guys have, you know, they've had some reticle that I wasn't familiar with and I wanted to look through it, and I've said, your glass is filthy. Let's clean it. So I've got the stuff there to clean glass. I've got the stuff there to check screws. There's been times that, yes, a forearm was touching their barrel, and we'll just quickly correct it right then before we start to shoot. Some people think, I know we'll get into this deeper later, that they need to show up with a clean barrel, and that's happened. And, well, we're going to have to foul it back in at 100. And once we actually start to shoot your rifle and you're doing the shooting, that's what we're doing is a 100-yard zero check. And there's been plenty of people that it was spot on as soon as they showed up. There's been lots of times we've mounted a scope before they started the day. You know, guy brought his rifle and brought a scope in a box and some rings that I recommended and a base, and we'll put it all together, you know, fairly quickly, and then we'll bore sight it and zero it. And if he's borrowing one of mine, which actually happened a few weeks ago, his rifle is perfectly capable. I knew it would be, but his scope was not. He wanted to get into the type of scopes that would do this a little easier or a lot easier. And I said, I'm gonna loan you a scope that I have that is inside your budget, and you get to use it all day. And then I'll bring down some other scopes for you to look through and look down range with them, just to help you make an informed decision on rifle scope purchase. Because sure, when your standards get high enough, you got to look at it as an investment. You know, the ones that are really well functioning, good glass, reliable, tough, they're expensive. And, you know, maybe you want one and be able to move it around. And, you know, that's why I offer that. People, here, look through my stuff, see what you think about it.
That's, you know, there's two things there that I want to get into. You mentioned the term fouling in, and I know that there's a lot of folks that I've talked to that they clean their rifle after rifle season, they put it in their gun safe, and they pull it out and they go hunting. And so they may still have oil in that barrel and they think they're protecting it. And then they're going to shoot thinking that rifle, when they're about to shoot it, is going to be exactly spot on as when they left it the last time. And could you explain to everybody what fouling is and how that can affect accuracy?
So whether it's a brand new custom barrel, whether it's a factory button rifle barrel, a hammer forged barrel, one that's never been fired, it needs to be fouled in because there's tooling imperfections in the rifling from the machine that made that rifle barrel. You know, you just got to realize that a rifle barrel starts life as a piece of bar steel, and there's barrel drills, which is effectively a type of lathe that bores the hole down the center, and then there's multiple ways of cutting rifling into that, but it's going to have imperfections within that tooling, especially the brand new barrel. So someone coming out to shoot or dropping the rifle off for me to make it shoot, I will actually clean one that's dropped off, and then I'm going to foul it back in. So fouling back in, what that means is just putting some rounds down the barrel to fill in those imperfections. Those tooling imperfections get smoothed in a little bit via copper from the jacket from the bullet, as well as carbon from the burning of the powder following the bullet. So you're filling in imperfections in the rifling, and then you've got to learn, every barrel is going to be different. You've got to learn first, how many rounds is required for this barrel to foul in and start to shoot well. I've seen a friend of mine, he brought out a rifle of his that he hunts with and had me do a load development, and I need to send you the pictures, but it told the tale perfectly. The first 3 shots out of this brand new barrel that's never been fired but was clean, and all 3 rounds are loaded exactly the same. They're my hand loads. The group was about 8 inches wide and tall. Let that barrel cool back off down to no heat, shoot the exact same load again at 100 yards. Now the group was 2 inches. Let it cool off again. no heat left in the barrel. Rounds 7, 8, and 9 went inside of an inch. Well, that told me that barrel is fouled in 9 rounds. But what is subjective is some will be fouled in 3 rounds. Some will be fouled in 6. Some might be fouled in 14 before they start to show some consistency of where their bullets are landing on paper. You've got to learn that number for your barrel. You've got to find how many foulers are required for this thing to return to 0 if it lost 0 and start to shoot consistent. Then the second number you've got to learn is how many rounds will it tolerate before it needs to be cleaned again. I've got barrels that I've put 600 rounds down and they're still shooting like a champ. I've got one rifle that I carry around with me pretty much every day that it's pretty finicky. It likes to be cleaned every 50 rounds, but it only needs 2 to foul back in. You know, most of them don't need 9. Here's the other thing that's a kind of a change is as any barrel gets more rounds down it, oftentimes the number of foulers required becomes less because you've effectively lapped your barrel. You've smoothed out your barrel through a lot of rounds fired down the barrel. Myself and a lot of guys that shoot competitively, we've got a policy that we will not show up at a rifle match with a barrel with less than 200 rounds down it because you just can't completely trust it yet. And here's because it fouled in, it'll actually start to shoot tighter after a couple hundred rounds, and it'll speed up. Barrels will actually start producing more velocity after the 200 to 250 round count. So the exact same powder lock, charge, everything, and say you got a 6.5 Creedmoor with a 140 grain going 2750 when it was a new barrel, and 200 to 250 rounds down the barrel, you're now running 2800. That's why you're not going to show up to a match with a barrel less than 200 rounds down it, because you do not want to speed up in the middle of a match and not know it, because you may dial a known correction for a known distance and all of a sudden you missed over the top of the target. Well, that's because you got more velocity all of a sudden because your barrel got long-term fouled in. So that's what the fouling in means. There are some out there that like to shoot clean. There's bench rest guys that I'm aware of that they'll clean their bore and then they'll shoot their stage and then they'll clean their bore. But for most hunters, that's probably the wrong thing to do, because there's been tales I've read that bench rest guy, he'll shoot clean and he's got the time to clean in the middle. If he doesn't clean it, it's going to start to shoot poorly because the load was developed with a clean barrel. As a hunter, and as a hunter that potentially hunts 12 months a year, I don't want any part of that. I want a barrel that I know once I get 3 to 6 rounds down it, it's stable, it's keeping it 0, and therefore I can make my corrections downrange. And, you know, I checked 0 on the one that I carry every day 3 months ago and have made a few shots with it on coyotes and hogs since then, and everything's fine. And it's been riding around the truck, the tractor, the side-by-side, and it's fouled in every day. There's nothing wrong with putting them away clean. That's okay. If you put oil inside of a barrel, it will shoot terrible with oil in the barrel. No doubt about it. That has got to come out of there. You've got to look at carbon as a dry lube and get the oil back out of the barrel that hasn't been shot in 10 months, foul it back in, check your 0, then do whatever you've got to do from there. New rifles often will come in the box, and I've had a lot of people do this. They'll show up with a brand new unfired rifle and drop it off to me. They say it was unfired, but the good rifle makers did fire it before they sent it out. And right. They may also, the manufacturer may have put oil in that barrel to prevent it from rusting, you know, especially if you buy one, say, you know, one of my favorites is a Tikka, which are made in Finland. Well, as far as I know, Tikka may put oil down that bore to keep it from rusting from Finland to North America.
Sure.
So you've got to get all that out of there on a brand new fired or what you thought was an unfired barrel, because you need to start with knowns. And my cleaning process is not super aggressive. I've got a very non-toxic, not really aggressive solvent that's as thin as water. I put it on a dry patch and a 1-piece cleaning rod from chamber to muzzle, and get this solvent for 2 passes to sit inside that rifle and let it be there for about 10 minutes. And then I will not put a brass or bronze brush down a barrel, just a nylon brush. Just scrub that about 10 times. and then dry patches until there's no longer any carbon or copper showing on the patch. So basically I'm trying to work myself towards, when this patch goes from the chamber to the muzzle, it came out of the muzzle with nothing on it. It's still a white patch. I've seen as many as 30 passes before I could get there. There's others that after 10, I'm good, it's clean. And then foul it, check your 100-yard zero. You may have what's called a flyer or an outlier. You've got a point of aim and your bullet landed completely where you did not want it to land. Don't touch that scope. Shoot another one, and then another one. Most barrels will tolerate 3 rounds in a row. Let it cool back off. If you cleaned on a previously zeroed rifle and now you're checking zero and it's not where it was supposed to be, don't mess with that scope, because oftentimes it'll walk itself right back to where it was before you cleaned it. So I was there once upon a time. I fire a shot, I dial a correction. It went completely wrong place from where I wanted it, but it was a clean barrel. I had to learn the hard way. Foul it back in and then learn that line where, oh man, I'm 50 rounds in, I've got to clean it. Or I'm 500 rounds in, I got to clean it. But you need to know how many it takes to foul in, and then in later numbers, how many it'll tolerate before it starts to shoot poorly. And a lot of us, that's the only time we clean, is when it starts to shoot poorly.
I hear you talking about like the flyers and really trying to make sure you're doing, your due diligence to kind of sight in a rifle. And one thing that I noticed immediately whenever you had done some reloading for my 280 AI Ackley improved rifle, the consistency of which high quality precision reloaded ammo was compared to factory. Because I don't know if everyone understands, some folks, I was at Carter's Country not too long ago, and this guy was buying a rifle, and he had never bought a rifle before. And the guy behind the counter is like, you need this and you need this ammo. Well, you don't necessarily know if that's the particular ammo that's going to be best in that rifle. And, he might be getting, 2 MOA, roughly 2, inches, 3 shots within 2 inches there at 100 yards. And there might be another ammo that's factory that he's going to be getting, 1 MOA. And then you might be able to have hand loads that are sitting at 0.25 MOA. And a lot of folks don't really understand the differences therein. And also I think with the factory and how inconsistent it can be, because literally these ammo manufacturers are having millions of rounds of ammo. There's not going to be the exact same charge of powder each time. And I was blown away when you started talking to me about the level of precision. And why don't you talk about how precise that you are measuring when you're doing reloading, and what effects that is for the person who's actually going to be using that ammo?
Good, really good question. And I've told a lot of people this, that there's some things in the world that the handmade thing is better than the mass production thing. Hand-loaded rifle ammo is one of those things. You go to Texas hunting forum and you look at the knife section, and the guys that are the legitimate blade makers, they can make one be the exact hardness they want. They're beautiful knives, and I would say they're better than mass production knives with the expert knife makers. Those are a couple of things where the handmade thing is better. Of course, there's leather workers that are the same way. Mm-hmm. But on the ammunition side, I do not know how exactly powder charges are placed in a piece of brass in the mass production facility. It's probably what's called thrown powder. And some people throw powder in their own pistol, or what people refer to as plinking ammo. They don't care that it's super precise. They're just trying to maintain a certain size of group, which would be potentially very large. But I've actually got to pull apart some mass production ammo. He brought me some fired brass, as well as there was 10 live rounds, and said, can you pull those bullets and dump that powder and put your powder charge back in and reseat that bullet? I said, I can do that. So I got the opportunity to check how consistent powder charges were in this mass production ammo that was quite expensive. It was $75 for 20 rounds. The answer was the powder charge varied in 300 Winchester short mag by 3 grains. most hand loaders have scales that read 0.1 grain, whether it be a certain digital scale like an RCBS Chargemaster, whether it be a beam scale. There's really good beam scales out there, but most everyone can maintain a 0.1 grain consistency from one piece of brass to the next. Then there's those of us that were what could be referred to as chasing the dragon. We wanted an ultimate consistency of powder charge, and there are now scales available, and I have one that reads to 0.02 grain of powder. There are lots of powders out there. That is one single kernel of powder. And for people that don't know what a kernel of powder is, imagine a regular wooden pencil and the lead sticking out, and you cut the lead off. It's about that diameter. You cut the lead about less than an 1/8 inch long, probably more like a 1/16. That is a kernel of powder. There's powders that will read 0.02 on the scale. So the load development process for any cartridge, any barrel out there is I start with a clean bore. I have a piece of brass for this cartridge, and the neck is cut. The neck is cut longitudinally. It's basically creating no neck tension. I will seat the bullet. I know it's sticking out of the brass way too far, and that's on purpose. It's just a piece of brass and a bullet. Write it down, measure it and write it down, chamber it in the chamber, eject it, and measure it again. The goal is the rifling will drive the bullet into the brass because it's crashing into rifling, the rifling shoving that bullet into that brass because it's able to slip. Once I get measurement 2 after ejecting, I will readjust my seating die. I've got to pull that bullet back out. Now I will seat it really close to the measurement I've just achieved after ejection. Chamber it again. I've done this in as few as 5 tries, and there's been other times it took 15 tries, but eventually I'm trying to find where is your rifling in relation to this bullet. I do not care what the publications say on maximum overall cartridge length. When I load for someone's rifle, I'm loading this ammo specific to this chamber that's sitting in front of me. So overall lengths are irrelevant to me. I want to get your bullet about 2 thousandths short of rifling. I don't want to jam it in the rifling because you can get yourself into trouble there. And then pick an appropriate powder. I like to use temperature stable powders, or ones that claim to be temperature stable. Temperature unstable, there are some out there that for every degree ambient temperature increase outdoors, you get as far as 2 to 3 feet per second increase in velocity at the muzzle. Temperature stable powders don't do that. As you're shooting in 50-degree weather or 100-degree weather, your muzzle velocity doesn't change near as drastically. You know, none of them are immune. There's no perfect ones, but I use the ones that are touted and known as being temperature stable powders. I just don't want to get into a muzzle velocity variation for anyone's rifle, including myself. A temperature stable powder appropriate for this cartridge and this bullet weight. And then I will look at publications on maximum published charge. And they'll always publish a minimum and a maximum recommended powder charge for this bullet in this cartridge. And I typically start in the middle. And that's, that's where I start is a middle charge. And those are my Fowlers at 100. And that is going to be my test load, my first test load at between 200 to 500 yards. I don't do any load testing less than 200 yards. I'll start at that middle charge, depending on cartridge, shoot for 3 if the barrel can tolerate 3 at 200 yards. Then the next thing I do is, depending on the size of the powder charge total, is step the powder charge up in weight. So for a 223 Remington, for example, my next charge may be 0.2 grain more powder, and then shoot that for a group at 200. Then the next one's another 0.2 on top of that. A 300 Win Mag, I may step in 0.4 to 0.5 grain increments. And I'm testing which one of these charges shoots the best. And then once I know what that is, and this is what we call the load, this is the right powder charge for this bullet cartridge combo in this barrel. Every round is loaded to that 0.02 grain consistency. I'll allow it to be 0.02 light or 0.02 heavy, because if you don't allow it, you're going to find yourself with a razor blade cutting kernels of powder in half. And no one can shoot that well anyway to notice an extra kernel or a light kernel of powder. So 0.02 grain error is what I will allow. So if I've got a 300 Win Mag with a 75 grain powder charge, if it reads 74.98 or 75.02, I'll load it. But then every round loaded after that is exactly that charge from now on. And when I sit down at the bench to make all of your ammo, I will not leave the bench until it's finished. I want the humidity in the room to be the same for every charge. I want the scale to be calibrated the same for every charge. It is extremely rare for me to not load all of your ammo in one sitting. Now, there was one customer of mine that he decided that he wanted, when I was finished, to go home with 1,000 rounds. And I couldn't sit there for 10 hours loading his ammo that day. So I had to spread it out a little bit. But most people don't want 1,000 rounds. Most people want 200 and they're good with that. So I will sit down and load the remaining primed brass available in one sitting. So when you're leaving, your ammo is the same for every shot fired as long as it's available in your box.
Just kind of give some background. I came to you through the Texas Hunting Forum, and I talked to you about what I was looking for in a precision rifle. I had owned a lot of different, stock rifles, and some of them shot well, some of them had not. Once I kind of became a better shooter and was more disciplined in certain ways, I could be able to see, hey, this particular rifle with this factory ammo, the best factory ammo, maybe I'm shooting 1.5 inch grouping, and that might be the best that that I'm going to get with factory ammo. And whenever I knew I wanted to start being able to reach out, and especially like you said, in Texas, we have feral hogs, right? So I'm seeing feral hogs sometimes 500 yards, 600 yards. And I want to make sure that I'm making the most ethical shot possible, even on something that's a, non-indigenous invasive, destructive animal as such. I'm still wanting to put it down because also they're great to eat. And I want to make sure that I'm doing my due diligence. And I wanted to be able to start having the tightest shooting rifles that I possibly could. And when I came to you talking about what I wanted to have built, we kind of walked through what is the purpose and what is the intent of what I wanted to do with this rifle. And then you were like, okay, now let's build it. Here's some options. And that was something that was, monumental, because I think some people are just like, I want to get this big one. And, you're not going to use a 30-06 when you're maybe, shooting prairie dogs or something like that, just as you're not going to probably be shooting some, tinier, 22 250 necessarily on an elk or something. You're going to have the right tool for the right job in your toolbox. And sometimes that requires having, multiple rifles. What I was looking for was, something very specific in Texas, bigger game, and then eventually maybe moving on to the elk world too. And, we can talk about that kind of, the idea of how you're customizing the exact rifle and build for the particular job. But one thing that when you were talking about reloading and when we were talking about the development, you were telling me one thing that was super important. And I think it comes into play when you're talking about reloading 200 rounds at a time, is like the focus you have to have, 0 distractions, and all the things that you need to eliminate so there aren't any issues. When you mentioned temperature stable powders as well, there's a lot of things that can go wrong if you are not sure of what you're doing when you're reloading. And this is not something that somebody can get into haphazardly. And so I kind of want you walk me through some of the maybe things that you've learned from other people's mistakes, and some of the things that whenever someone is, safety wise, what are some of the things that you're really trying to teach people when they're out in the field and when they're reloading as well? Because I know you teach people to reload as well. And I mean, you walked me through that, and now I'm at the same thing. I have that 0.02 grains. I have the same equipment that you have there too. I am super precise, and it took me a long time. And I also made some mistakes too, where I wasn't paying attention. I, took a phone call, or, and I'm like, I think I had that measured out, dump it over, start it over again, because this isn't a room where you can have any mistakes, because they can be very consequential. And that's something that I kind of want you to talk about the safety aspect of folks who are moving into that and thinking about moving into that?
So the safety procedures on making ammo is, do your due diligence on the parts you're putting together to create a finished cartridge. Any centerfire rifle or pistol cartridge out there is four things. It's a case, often made out of brass. Some of those are brass that are nickel covered. I don't use that. But brass, primer, powder, bullet. When we start talking about really precise shooting a rifle, one thing we've got to talk about first is the twist rate of the barrel. Every barrel's got to, of course, twist, because anyone that's maybe never fired a center fire shot, or even rimfire for that matter, way back in the Revolutionary War, they started rifling barrels, so that rotates that bullet, just like if you watch a football go through the air. It's exactly the same thing as what a bullet has to do. It has to be spinning to be stable. So when you start talking about twist rate, one good example is a common 30 caliber twist rate is a 1 in 10. So that makes one revolution over the course of 10 inches of barrel length. That's a pretty universal barrel twist rate for a 30 caliber. There's 300 Win Mags out there with a 1 in 10. There's 30-06s. There's 308 Winchester. And by the way, those all take the same bullet. It's a 30 caliber barrel with it. They're all just chambered differently. So when you've got a caliber, whether it be a 30 caliber, a 7mm, a 6.5, you've got to learn the twist rate for that barrel, and then pick the appropriate length bullet for that twist rate. The 1 in 10 30 caliber, a 300 Win Mag, I know for a fact it'll safely and consistently shoot a 200 grain or heavier bullet in a 300 Win Mag. 308 will do it as well. It's just going to be really, really slow, but it will be stable coming out of there. If you've got a very relaxed twist rate, you brought up 22-250 earlier. The old standard for 22-250 was a 1 in 14. So it makes one revolution over the length of 14 inches of barrel. Because of that relaxed twist rate, it will not properly stabilize a bullet heavier, which actually means longer, than 55 grains. If you tried to put a 75 grain in that 22-250 with a 1 in 14, it's not going to be stable. It could be as bad as what's called keyholing at 100. It's hitting the target sideways because it's not drilling a hole, it's now tumbling. So first thing is match your twist rate to your barrel, your bullet length, the proper bullet for this twist rate in this caliber. And that's published. It's out there. Two really easy places to find that is Schillen Barrels has a chart available online, and so does Lilja. They have twist rate on their barrels. Berger's got a twist rate calculator that you plug in a caliber, one of their bullets, and it'll tell you how stable it's going to be. So pick the appropriate bullet length, bullet weight for your twist rate. Next thing is there's free online data. You can buy reloading manuals if you'd like. I've got two manuals made by bullet makers, and I've had them for a long time. I rarely reference them anymore. Hogden.com is a powder manufacturer, and they also create IMR powder. And they've got a really friendly website where you can go plug in your cartridge, plug in your bullet, and you can say, give me every single powder possible to load in this cartridge, or you can pick some powders. If you've talked to some friends and say, hey, I've got this 308, I'm going to load a 178 grain in it. What powder should I run? And they give you a recommendation. Verify that's a listed powder for that cartridge. And then via the manuals or websites, it'll give you a minimum and maximum charge in theory for that cartridge and that bullet. There are some rifles out there that you cannot go up to maximum charge when you're testing. I've got one of my own that I could not get to maximum charge before it was showing pressure signs. What that means is when I'm doing a load testing on my own rifle or someone else's, after every shot fired, I'll eject the brass and I'll look at the case head. And when you look at your case head and it looks exactly the same as it did before you fired it, everything's okay. As you start increasing high pressure, you'll have what's called an extractor mark. On a bolt action rifle, when you're going to eject, you have to rotate that bolt handle towards the sky. That rotation can scratch the head of the brass because the brass got forced backward into the case head because of high pressure. So that's what's called an extractor mark. There's probably photos of them online. When you start getting an extractor mark, you are being warned to stop adding powder. You can continue to climb. It could be just that piece of brass. I've had that happen, that, you know, I've got a 3-shot string I'm shooting here. Shot number 1 looked clean. Shot number 2 had a very faint extractor mark. Shot number 3 looked clean. Okay, that was just that piece of brass. And you can potentially climb on up. If you go up to continuing to get extractor marks, you're now pushing your luck. You're gonna most likely not hurt yourself, but you could potentially be hurting your rifle. A late sign is what's called a blown primer. When you have added way too much powder than you should have, and you eject that brass, the primer is no longer sitting in the primer pocket. You'll see an empty primer pocket that's black. It blew a primer. You're now way past where you should be for safe ammo. There's powders out there being temperature sensitive. Some friends of mine came to use my range and this cartridge and this bullet, and they picked a powder and asked what I thought, and I said I wouldn't touch it. They were here in April, and it was about 75 degrees. They were doing some load testing on their own, and they got an area where they wanted to run their next test, and they didn't make it back out here till June. Well, in June it was over 90 degrees. The exact same load from April was now blowing primers because that powder was temperature sensitive. It was now increasing velocity, increasing chamber pressure. So they now have unsafe ammo in the summertime. And don't ignore extractor marks. You know, keep that in mind when you're looking for pressure. Obviously, ear protection if it's a not suppressed rifle. If it's a muzzle brake or a bare muzzle, I've got ear protection on. I shoot from inside of a steel building. The muzzle's pointing outside, but man, it does echo. And I kind of developed in my later years that it echoes so bad and it's so stinking loud that I will now wear earplugs and muffs simultaneously. And here, you know, new hearing is not free. So eye protection as well, especially on an AR, especially on anything that is a gas operated semi-automatic. You definitely want eye protection on. You really should on any kind of shooting, especially with the semi-auto rifles or pistols for that matter. You don't want powder hitting you in the eyeballs, you know, because that's what gas is what's making that thing cycle on its own. So ear protection and eye protection are very important while you're shooting. Then when you're loading that ammo, whether you were loading test loads or now you found your load and you're going to now be making ammunition for yourself, don't have more than one kind of powder sitting on the bench. Only have the right powder for this cartridge sitting on the bench. If you take a powder that is designed for 45 ACP or 9mm or shotgun, we can get into the burn rate chart. It is a very, very fast burn rate. If you put that much powder in a .308 Winchester, you will have what's called a detonation. You'll probably blow up your rifle and probably hurt yourself. So if you were loading 45 auto on Saturday and now you're going to be loading .308 Winchester on Sunday, make very sure that 45 auto powder is not even anywhere near the loading equipment. Put it away. Get your .308 powder out. Don't have more than one powder on the bench, because you could inadvertently say, oh man, my hopper's low, my powder trickler's low, I need to refill it, and you accidentally grab that other powder that is way inappropriate for this cartridge. So there's a safety measure as well. Anybody that calls or texts me when I'm loading ammo, you're going to have to wait. I'm not answering the phone. I'm not going to get on a text. I'm not going to answer a text. I will have a radio on. I've got a radio playing in the background, but no TV, nothing. I'm focused in on doing this and making sure the scale's reading exactly what it's supposed to read. You can't put a double charge, technically speaking, in a rifle cartridge. I've heard horror stories of people doing a double charge on accident in 44 mag, and you'll blow something up. And I'm not going to do that either. So final safety procedure for me is lots of manufacturers as well as custom craftsmen out there make what's called a loading block. A loading block is where you can stand your primed brass up with the mouth pointing towards the ceiling, and it's sitting there where it won't fall over when you put your funnel on your brass. So what I do, some people don't do this, but I do this. I'll put my funnel on my brass. I'll dump the powder down the funnel. I'll put my pan back on my scale. While it's measuring out the next charge, I'm seating a bullet. Immediately, I'm seating a bullet in that charged piece of brass, and then it is set over in your ammo box or my ammo box. So I know if there's a bullet sticking out of that brass, it's loaded. before that, before going into the loading block, I've got a friend that he hand loads for himself. He tests this stuff at my range, and that's fine. And he got with me about 5 days earlier. I've never made this mistake, but he did, and now he does things my way. He lives about 30 miles away. He got with me on Monday and said, "Can I come shoot Saturday? I've got some test loads I need to shoot." I said, "Yeah, come on out." And I went down there and visited with him a minute at the platform at the zero line, and went back to my shop, and I was working on some other project, and I never heard a shot fired. And then he pulls up to the shop to tell me goodbye. And I said, "What happened here?" He said, "I've got brass that's got a powder and bullet in it, but no primers." So he loaded powder and bullet in his brass and forgot his primers, because what he didn't do that I do now, or I've always done, is I put them upside down in that loading block first.
Yep.
So that I can see that they do in fact have a primer in them. Primer selection is fairly important. If you put a, let's say you're the 308 again. If you put a Magnum rifle primer in a short action like that, that's okay. You can do that. It could create a little more power inside the brass. So with that Magnum primer in a powder charge that's under 45 grains, you may not get up to maximum powder charge because your primer is what's called a little hotter primer. So proper primer selection, and there's a lot of options for a lot of cartridges. Proper powder selection for the cartridge and bullet weight, and work your way towards maximum. Don't ever start at maximum. You climb up to it. And one of my rifles, it won't tolerate a published maximum charge because it tells me that by looking at the brass. I just can't go up there with that particular rifle, and that's okay. I got it to shoot well below that maximum charge. There's others out there. I typically do not do this for someone else, but I've got a bunch of rifles that there was no published data, and I had to just go figure it out. You know, what is maximum powder charge? Well, I've got to go find that out in this rifle via loading it and shooting it, and document my findings, and I figured out where maximum is. Or maybe I never even got there because I got it shooting well before it was showing me pressure signs. So yes, there's a lot of safety aspect here, but in the end, because of that variation in powder charge and mass production ammo, the hand loader can technically make safer ammo at times than the mass production, because that person's powder charge is so consistent from one to the next, and their ammo is actually really safe if they followed all the safe loading practices.
And you talk about, you know, making sure you're having the right powder and the right primer, and kind of pairing everything together to make sure that you have the best ingredients. Now, we're kind of still in the time that I'm seeing where there's still some difficulty in finding certain components. And in the last couple of years, it was slim pickings for factory ammo, for reloading. You know, I saw some astronomical prices on people that were just paying, you know, ridiculous amounts, 10, 15 times what they're paying for primers before, or even just brass. And, you know, for those who don't know, we can go into that too. You can reload brass multiple times, and there's different techniques there too. But, you know, primer, it's a one-shot deal. You know, your bullet's downrange, so, you know, your powder is gone. So there's certain times that you're having to make sure that you have enough equipment on hand to be able to continue as your hobby, or if you're shooting, or for someone like yourself. I figured this would be a very difficult time for you, because you got people coming with all sorts of different cartridges and wants and needs for what they're doing. Walk me through what that was like for you, and what it's still like. Are you still seeing issues? Has it gotten any better? You know, I want to hear from your perspective. You deal with this more than anyone else I know.
So yeah, it's been extremely difficult through all of 2020, through all of 2021, and even right now I've got some difficulties. We first saw the first problem we ran into in early 2020 was the primers. I've never seen something like this before. We got to where we just couldn't get primers. I mean, I've got accounts set up as wholesale, you know, as dealer pricing, and it wasn't that certain suppliers wouldn't sell to me. It was that they're just out of stock. They just did not have primers. So Fortunately, I had a decent supply still on hand, but I scoured the internet every day looking at certain websites for primers. And for the first time in my life, I went for 14 months without the ability to buy any primers. So I went from January of 20 to April of 21 without making a primer purchase because there was none available. Wow. The theory is, I don't want to get into politics, but sure, with COVID coming up, with election coming up, with people were a little afraid. You've got long-term Americans that own firearms that were now supplying up. You've got new gun owners with insurrection happening in America. People worried about someone kicking in their door and, terrorizing someone in their home. And you had old gun owners and new gun owners that were now buying ammunition. So my opinion is the reason there was no primers available for hand loaders is because those primers were going to the big ammunition manufacturers, such as Hornady, Federal. Remington was out of the picture at the time. Primers were not available to hand loaders because they were going to the big ammunition manufacturers. If a guy like me is making what you would call a big order of 5,000 primers, that pales in comparison to Hornady asking for 2 million.
Sure.
So the primers were going to the big manufacturers because the big manufacturers were cranking out ammunition. So I just couldn't get primers. And then later, like I said, that slightly relaxed a little. It hasn't relaxed for long periods of time. For the last almost 3 years now, I've made some primer purchases since then, but it was fairly small quantities as compared to the past, and I've got to get it from multiple sources. So you've just got to stay on your toes looking for suppliers that have primers. And fortunately for me, I've got friends that know I need to have parts on hand for when the phone rings and someone needs me to take their rifle and make it run for them. So I've got friends that will notify me, hey, such and such company has some primers available, and I buy some. The other problem we ran into was brass and bullets, and powder for that matter. I've needed a certain powder and just couldn't get it and just have to keep watching for it. But I can get real specific on bullets I think for all of 2020 and all of 2021, I couldn't buy hardly any 6.5 millimeter bullets. There just was no 6.5s available. Well, the popularity gain of the 6.5 Creedmoor, that's what it shoots, is a 6.5 millimeter bullet. And now you've got ammunition manufacturers making that ammo, so that's where the bullets were going. But in that time, I could still get a bullet that's called a 224, is what it's actually labeled. So a 223 Remington shoots a 224 bullet. So does a 22-250 and a host of others.
And just real quick, explain that because I know that's a measurement, but what exactly are whenever you're hearing 7 millimeter, you're hearing 30-06, or you're hearing 6.5, for those who might not know, and again, I saw this the other day when there was a guy who's buying, he's like, he had no idea the difference between a 270 and a 6.5. He just thought it was the name that they named that particular rifle, but all those numbers are actually measurements.
Yes. So that is bore size. That is bore diameter. That you've got grooves and lands in a bore. Any barrel maker has grooves and lands, and it's the groove diameter. The lands are actually smaller. That's what grips the bullet. Your bullet gets engraved when it goes down a barrel. So when we start talking cartridge nomenclature, all these manufacturers for decades, potentially over 100 years, have made this confusing, and it frustrates me so bad because people call me with these questions, and it's just because of the name of the cartridge. The 308 Winchester is shooting a 308 bullet. The 30-06 is shooting a 308 bullet. The 300 Win Mag is shooting a 308 bullet. The 6.5 millimeter is coming out of a 6.5 Creedmoor. It's also coming out of a 260 Remington, a 264 Win Mag, and a host of others, a 6.5 284. So someone will call it the metric, some will call it the standard in fractions of an inch or decimals of an inch, and the names just get extremely confusing. A 270 Winchester is technically a 277 diameter bullet. The 223 Remington is, you buy 224 bullets. The 224 Valkyrie, same thing, 22-250. They just called it 22 on the front end, but it takes a 224 bullet. So it's bore diameter. For anyone that wants to research this, you can go to Bartlein barrels, Krieger barrels, Obermeyer's, just pick barrel manufacturers. There's not that many calibers of barrels out there. we can go down the list, and it's not that long, of 17, 204, 224, 257, 6 millimeter and 243. That's the same thing. The 243 Winchester shoots a 243 bullet or a 6 millimeter bullet. It's the same bullet. 6.5 millimeter, 277, 7 millimeter, and we'll just stop at 308. That's under 10. That's under 10 bore diameters, under 10 bullet sizes, but I just named off bores that would take a list of thousands of different cartridges. So that's where the chamber comes in. You buy a 30 caliber blank, that's all it is. It looks like a stick of metal with a hole down the center. There's no chamber in it. A gunsmith, a lathe operator that knows what he's doing, he creates the chamber. So if you bought a 7 millimeter barrel, you're going to be running 7 millimeter or 284 diameter bullets. They're the same thing. It just depends on what it's called. And that 7 millimeter, is it going to become a 7 millimeter 08 or a 7 millimeter Rim Mag or a 280 Remington or a 280 Ackley Improved, a 284 Winchester? That's all the same barrel for those different cartridges, and that they all take the same diameter of bullet. So back to the supply chain, the 2020, 2021, I could not get a 6.5 millimeter hunting bullet that I want, or target bullet for that matter. They just were not available. And I could still get 30 cal, I could still get 224, and I was buying 7 millimeter. I'm a big 7 millimeter fan. 7 millimeter does everything well. I couldn't get a 6.5. The last 6 months, I can't buy a 7 millimeter, but I've been buying 6.5, 6.5 millimeter. So they quit making 7s, and now they're making 6.5. So I've had to stay on top of this and play the long game for the last 3 years. In 2019, I didn't have to keep an inventory. I didn't have to keep any inventory that wasn't for my own rifles, because in 2019, if someone brought me their rifle, I just got online and ordered what I needed. It was no big deal. Every single part that I could possibly want was available from multiple sources. So someone brought me a 300 Win Mag, I would get online, order brass, maybe I made a powder and a primer order. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I just ordered brass and bullets, but I could get what I wanted right then. I didn't have to keep an inventory. But the last 3 years, there are certain bullets that are popular all the time. I don't own a 300 Win Mag, but I know the cartridge really well now, because it literally is the #1 most popular thing that's been dropped off to me to make it shoot well, is a 300 Win Mag. Americans like 30 cals, and there's a lot of 300 Win Mags out there, and that's okay. And I just know a couple of bullets that everybody's been really happy with on game performance, and bullets I've been happy with at how tight I can make them shoot. So now I just always keep some on the shelf for when the phone rings. I go, yeah, I got the part sitting there. So it's kind of forced me to tie up some of my funds and turn it into bullets and powder and brass. But that's what I've got to do, because if someone drops off a rifle and I just can't get parts, I'm just going to be sitting on that rifle until I can get parts, which could be months later. Had someone dropped off a 6.5 Creedmoor to me in early 2020, it would have been a year later before I could have bought bullets for that rifle. So I'm having to kind of stay on top of things. But what you'll see is, exactly as I explained, certain things are not available for months, and then they switch. Now you can not get the thing you bought 8 months ago, but you can get the other thing that wasn't available 8 months ago. So I think that bullet makers obviously run certain things at certain times. Brass makers run certain things at certain times, and you just got to watch it become available online and get it, snatch it up when it shows up. I'm not a hoarder. I'm just trying to stay with the ability to take care of someone's ammunition problem for them.
Let's say that someone comes to you and they're going to want to put together a custom rifle. What are the different components that you're going to be looking at? I know that there's stock, barrel, trigger, action, and then there's gunsmithing that's involved in all those things. So let's say, like, when I came to you and I was like, I want to get, something for, deer hunting in Texas, and I'm going to be shooting at, let's say, 100 to 300 yards. And I have, a budget of, let's say, $2,000. What are you starting out with, and how are you going to go ahead and make a blueprint for that? And what goes into actually creating that custom rifle that you're going to have the Jason Garvey special?
So the 2000 is a little bit of a tight budget. It's doable, but you know, in my opinion, the most important piece of this machine is the barrel quality. And then number two, the way that it was chambered and turned down to a shoulder and threaded. That's where a machinist comes in. There's lots of them across America that are really good ones. Really high quality barrel. I've got my favorite. I'm not sponsored by them. Every time I've used this barrel maker, it's going to be fine. The question that I've got to ask someone when they start talking about a rifle is, what are you doing with it? What's its job going to be? If you're getting in touch with me because you want a really good shooting prairie dog rifle, well, I need to know that. I wouldn't want to go to the prairie dog fields with that 300 Win Mag. It's waste of money in components. It's a whole lot more recoil. And the flip side is also the same. If you're telling me I'm heading to Colorado to elk hunt and I want enough horsepower, I want enough energy out to 500 yards, well, that's a completely different cartridge. So when you're putting together a certain rifle for someone, do they want a featherweight? Do they want one they're going to carry in the mountains and weigh as little as possible? Do they walk 50 yards from a fuller to a box blind and don't need a long barrel? Are they going to run it suppressed? Are they going to run a brake? You know, what are you doing with this thing? A lot of people, when I ask those questions, what's the job of this rifle? Then they'll kind of let me, you know, oftentimes guide them on what it should be chambered in, what cartridge it should be. Some come to me with they want one put together with a certain chambering. Then the parts come in. You know, you brought up a while ago about a donor rifle. You know, you can actually go to Cabela's or Academy and buy a rifle and then switch the barrel out on it. That would have been a donor rifle. I've got some that were donor rifles. I bought, I didn't have an FFL years ago. Had an FFL order me a Tika and changed the barrel out. You know, got a gunsmith to put a custom barrel in his lathe and do the turning and make this barrel fit this action. And that came from a donor rifle. Or there are now even more what are called custom actions. That's what these companies make is really high quality actions. And that is what is considered the firearm when it's getting sent through the mail is the action. So you'll get an action and a bolt. That's it on those custom action makers. They're going to make the whole project far exceed a $2,000 budget because that action is taking up half that money.
Sure.
You know, if you're wanting to try to save some, then we may use a RIM 700 action or a Tika, and that would come from a donor rifle. You actually can't buy those actions usually all by themselves. Not a Tika, you can't. Some people want to build on a Savage, some want to build on a Winchester 70. That's fine. You know, some people have, hey, I've got a rifle. I want it rebarreled. I want a new stock. So you know all the components that make the final machine work together are action bolt, trigger that are connected together. Obviously, bolt comes out of all of them. A barrel that has I don't do lathe work. I don't have a gunsmithing lathe. I will hire the guys that do that. I'm kind of the middleman. Get the barrel ordered, have it machined. What length did you want it? You know, when we're building something, and you know there might be someone that says, I want a 16 1/4 inch long 308 Winchester. Okay. You know, if you're going to go like I do, heading out west, in my opinion, west of Interstate 35 for the most part, mule deer, elk, and you say 7 rim mag, I'm going to recommend a 26-inch barrel because of, you know, back to burn rate of powder. It's a slow burn. You need the barrel length to create speed. And, the sky's the limit. You know, do you want kind of a run of the mill action? Do you want a custom action? What trigger do you want? What's your favorite kind of trigger poundage? There's triggers out there that you can turn them down to ounces. I don't have any of those. There's others that, you know, 1 to 2 pounds is usually preferred by most people. A lot of options on triggers. I've got a couple brands that I like. Then stock shape. You know, there's lots of stocks, different shapes and contours out there. What do you like? Some people ask me what what I recommend. How heavy of a barrel do you want? You know, if a guy's saying, I want a target rifle, I want to be able to go shoot a rifle match with long shot strings, that's the reason for really heavy duty barrels. Really thick, heavy contoured barrels is not because they shoot better, it's because they shoot well for more rounds in a row. If you've got a long, thin barrel that you hunt with, well, if you're just hunting with it, of course the goal is one shot and you're done, you're packing meat. Maybe two, but probably not even a third shot. Well, you don't want to tote around a heavy barrel in the mountains. There's no point. But if you're wanting to build a rifle just to shoot a whole lot of rounds in a row, that's where the thick, heavy barrel comes in, because it's not flexing more under heat from firing. So the sky's the limit. You start looking at all the makers of all the parts and pieces, and we'll just do what you want to do, you know. And barrel length, contour, do you want flutes? Do you not want flutes? What color do you want this to be when it's finished? What colors do you want it to be? What kind of camo pattern or no camo pattern or solid color? Typically, you know, the stock will get bedded and pillared. There are stock makers now sending pillars out inside the stock. What a pillar is, for those that don't know, most bolt actions are held into a stock with a forward and a rear action screw. The screw goes from underneath the stock in some kind of bottom metal through the trigger guard, goes through the stock, and then engages female threads in the action. So that's what's mating the action to the stock. You want a really hard contact of the full length of that action inside the inletting in the stock. Bedding compound is a two-part epoxy that you fill in those voids, you put the action in the stock. You've got to make sure that action has a release agent on it, and you give it 24 hours. So when you pull that back out, you'll see this bedding compound that is exactly the same female to the action shape. And then you'll have to clean some of it out of there. You know, you may have to get a Dremel with some files and get somewhere poured out into places you don't want it. But you're now making a really tight relationship of action to stock. But beyond the recoil lug, everything out there has a recoil lug. So the recoil lug is at the very forward end of the action, right where the barrel is connecting to the action. A barrel goes into an action just like a bolt goes into a nut. It threads in. Recoil lug is right there. So you now have a recoil lug that protrudes down into the stock and a pair of screws and bedded. You're now mating that action tight to that stock. Forward of the recoil lug, heading towards the forearm of the muzzle, you want no contact. That's a free floated barrel. That is a barrel that's never touching the stock. There's chassis out there. You know, I don't prefer chassis personally. They're made out of aluminum typically. They often come very adjustable length of pull. So that's the end of the stock. From the distance of the trigger to the end of the stock is length of pull. Someone with short arms would want a short length of pull. Standard length of pull in America is 13.5 inches. Some guys that are bigger, long arms, they want a longer length of pull so they can adjust that on the chassis. Comb height, that's where your cheek engages the stock. Everybody's eyes are different. Everybody's shape face is different. Your cheekbone location, that's actually what needs to be engaged in that stock, is your cheekbone. That height can be adjusted on a lot of those chassis. And there's some of those out there that the forearm of the stock from the barrel, you can see daylight between it. There's so much space. You know, I've seen as much as a ½ inch of space between the barrel and the forearm of the chassis. Typically on a stock, a composite stock, or even a wood stock, you don't go that much because it kind of starts to look a little bit ugly. But you know, a 16th inch I think is appropriate. A little more is even better. Mine have a little more than that, but hard contact of stock to, or excuse me, of action to stock, and no contact of barrel to stock. So you know, when the conversation begins, that's what it is. What do you need it to do? How heavy of a barrel do you want? Are you going to be carrying it for miles? Is it going to go in a backpack? You know, what kind of length? Are you running suppressor? You're going to run a brake? You're going to run nothing? Then we start talking about chambering, and basically you're building a tool for a job or several jobs. You know, there's a lot of cartridges that'll pull multiple duty. Good coyote guns, also a good deer rifle. You know, there's people that'll elk hunt and whitetail hunt with the same thing. I don't do that. I have my 7 mag was built for elk and mule deer. They're bigger, they're heavier, they're potentially got some distance on shot. When you go whitetail hunting with it, it tears up too much meat. So kind of right tool for the job.
Right.
I would say that, you know, good time to bring this up, that I need to write it basically an essay. And I've had this conversation so many times that most of us have had 5, 10 mediocre rifles sitting in the safe with maybe mediocre rifle scopes on them. And maybe really good ammo, maybe decent ammo, maybe ammo you never could get this rifle to shoot well. And you've got a lot of money tied up in those 10 rifles. And I've had a lot of people come to me and go, I'm done with this. I want to get down to less rifles, but really good ones. And they end up selling things they had that they didn't shoot. They didn't shoot them because they didn't like them. So there's where you say, well, a small, a medium, and a large. What I mean by that is the Prairie Dog rifle would be good for a small cartridge. That would be a good example of a small cartridge. A 223 Remington would be a good one. A 22-250, small bullet going fast. Medium would be something that would be really appropriate for whitetail hunting, hogs, what have you. In my opinion, you know, your 6.5 Creedmoor, 308 Winchester, 7mm 08, that's my favorite one out of the bunch. Short action, 473 bolt face, that's the diameter of the bolt, would be a good medium. And there's some that bleed over from one to the other. You get into the mid-grade kind of long action like a 30-06, you could call it a medium and a large. You could elk hunt with it, you could whitetail hunt with it. Your larges are typically anything that would have the word Magnum inside of them. 7mm rim mag, 28 nozzler is actually a Magnum, 300 Win Mag. You know, things with big long action, big powder charge, big heavy bullet, there'd be your large. You could have 3 of those other purchased rifles that shot really well, or rifles that were put together to your specifications for the job, and have basically the same amount of money tied up in 3 really good ones as you did 10 mediocre ones.
Sure.
And, you know, have hand loads for all if you want to go that route. And every time you pick it up for the job, you know it's going to do a good job for you.
What I did is I made sure that I was getting rid of things that were subpar and really taking things to another level. And I have, you know, the small, medium, and the large, and I have a couple extras of those too. But I feel like people need to realize, you know, if you're going to be a lifelong hunter, this rifle isn't something that's just going to be there for a season or two. You might have this for 10, 20, 30 years. And I know the one that you made me, that's going to go and be with my kids when I'm gone. This is going to be a lifelong rifle, unless, you know, I'm shooting the barrel out at certain points and times too. And, you know, I think you can talk to that too, because some people are shooting a lot. There's a certain life of each barrel, right? There's going to be a certain point in time where you might have to replace your barrel, but a lot of the other components might not be something you're having to replace. But really kind of getting into realizing, hey, you might be spending a little bit more for this barrel, or this, you know, upgrading your trigger system, or getting a good stock, or getting the right action, or paying for that, you know, awesome hand loaded, you know, ammo. Because when you're paying a little bit more averaged out over 20, 30 years, it's not going to be that big of an increase really. And you need to put your money into doing the right thing. But I think the same token goes is, you can have all those awesome parts. You can have this $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 rifle, but if you're not out there practicing, that doesn't mean anything, because when you pick that up, you're not going to be able to perform. And with those kinds of things in mind too, I wanted to have you kind of talk about some tips of like what you suggest to somebody who wants to be a precision shooter. What are you going to have them do when they come through your course, and what do you want them to do when they leave, and what kind of homework assignments are you giving them? And just kind of walk me through that as far as your advice, and, you know, making sure that you're not just a one and done thing that, you know, you've taught them for a day and they're gone. Like, what are you suggesting that they're going to be doing to maintain that level of precision?
Really, really important question there. Real quick, you brought up the life of a barrel. Yes, they've all got a barrel life. they will get shot out. You'll get what's called fire cracking. Some people call it alligator skin. You can put a bore scope down a barrel and see it. It's just cracking. All the rifling is cracking, and that's from an immense amount of heat and pressure going down that barrel for X number of rounds. The general rule of thumb is the smaller the bore, the faster the bullet, the faster that barrel is going to be shot out. I've shot out 260 Remington, and I've shot out 6.5 Creedmoor, and I've shot out 22 250. The 6.5 Creedmoor and the 260 Remington, I can tell you for sure at least my two did not exceed 2,500 rounds. They were done. They were completely done. They were shot out, and we're talking barrels that were so good that when I got their hand load made, they could literally put down a half-inch group at 200 yards for 5 shots. These were super good shooting barrels, but enough round count down them, they'd start throwing a flyer, and one of them, this is where I learned also, don't go to rifle match with one that's kind of on the edge of being shot out. And I remember, again, being up in Oklahoma, and we're towards the end of Sunday, so we're about done, and I'd had some misses that I couldn't explain. That's something else we haven't talked about is the end goal on the equipment is the equipment doesn't make you miss. When you put together the right parts between the rifle itself, the optic, the base, the rings, the ammo, none of that's missing. You want to get down to the point of the reason you missed was your fault. And oftentimes for experienced people, they were wrong about what wind was going on downrange. In my case, I remember this stage, it was right at 1,000 yards. And a guy beside me, he was waiting his turn, but he's looking through his rifle scope at what I'm shooting because he's about to be shooting it as well. And I dialed up elevation appropriately. I remember holding a right wind about a mil, and I missed into the wind. I had too much wind hold. So I saw my bullet land 3 o'clock off the target. My elevation was good. I was a half mil too much wind. I was allowed a follow-up shot on that stage. And I corrected my wind hold and fired a second shot, and it landed a mil below the target. And the guy next to me, we're good friends, and he's a really, really good rifle shooter. And I think he thinks I know what I'm doing. And he said, "What in the world just happened?" He said, "You missed a mil low," which for those that don't know that's 3 feet. The second shot fired was 3 feet low at 1,000 yards. And I said, "Man, I think my barrel's done." He said, "How many rounds were on that barrel before you came to this match?" And I said, 2,000. He said, "Well, you dummy, you should not have shown up here with that. Of course it's shot out." So I did the same thing with a 6.5 Creedmoor. I didn't take it to a match. I was testing it on my range, and it started throwing flyers, and I looked at my notes. I keep notes on everything. And it was approaching that 2,500 round mark. And I tell people, and so many other rifle guys will say this, barrels are like tires on a car or truck. You're going to wear them out. Now, having said that, there's a facility down in Kingsville called Rifles Only. I have not been there. I'd love to go. I probably will one day to shoot a match. The story online is the owner of that facility put 10,000 rounds down a 308. And this guy shoots a ton, and I believe he did, and then he rebarreled it. But being a 30 caliber bore and not a really high pressure cartridge, there's a good chance it did go that long. So most people just hunting and a little bit of practice, it'll take them years to shoot one out. There's guys out there that are competitive shooters, and they're really, really busy with it, and this was what they do, and all of their off time, they're either practicing or shooting matches. And I know of people that when they're putting together a rifle, they will buy 2 barrels, and they will take both barrels to their gunsmith that has the lathe and have him chamber and thread 2 barrels at the exact same time. The reason they're doing that is because they're going to shoot the first barrel out in 6 months. They shoot that much, and they probably have the right tools at home to switch their barrel out themselves, and they keep on going. So yes, there's a life of a barrel. My 22 250 was shot out in 1,200 rounds on the prairie dog field. Rebarreled it for 22 250, and now we're approaching there again. And you've got to watch that. Tips for shooting after you leave here. in your case, you traveled to this range from a pretty far distance. My previous record holders were broken this year. Previous record holders were Odessa, Texas, and Corpus Christi, Texas. That was the farthest people that's traveled. I had a guy get in touch with me in January, and he flew in from Atlanta to DFW, rented a car, and then stayed in a hotel in Greenville, Texas, and drove 20 minutes to my place the next morning. And he asked for a day and a half. I said, we'll go a day and a half or 2 days. You flew here. I mean, I'll do whatever it is you want to do.
Right.
I tell everyone before they leave, you've had me beside you this whole day correcting your shooting form. That's my job. I'm not being ugly. I'm not being rude, but you're slapping the trigger. You're not following through. Move your hips, point your toes out if we're shooting prone. Go positional stuff. Nope, don't put your right knee down, put your left knee down. Get your elbow to your knees. You've had me beside you all day making these fixes. Hopefully you leave remembering these things, but the tips for later, it doesn't matter if you live in town and you've got maybe a privacy fence in your backyard like so many people do. It doesn't matter if you live in an apartment. Dry firing is invaluable. I have dry fired no telling how many thousands of times on a center fire rifle. It does not hurt anything in the rifle. Get the rifle to be still and just make a click. It costs no money. You're not burning any ammo. You can dry fire from prone all the way to standing and everything in between. There's one thing you can do to practice. When my earlier days were of doing this, I would dry fire at length every day. When I get behind one of my rifles or someone else's, it will be dry fired 3 times at minimum before I fire a live round. I am learning this trigger or relearning this trigger. Close the bolt, click. At the same time, myself and anyone else, especially prone, you want to be squeezing that trigger on your exhale. Let all of your air out. Get your torso onto muscle and bone with not any air in the lungs. You are now a more stable shooting platform. In hot weather, humans' heart rate goes up, respiratory rate goes up because they're trying to cool off. So your respiratory rate's increased. You've got less time in between what's called the natural respiratory pause to make that shot. So if you've got lungs partially full of air or you're in the middle of a breathing cycle, that's not the time to squeeze that trigger, that last ounces it needs to fire. So even prone, you can dry fire for free. The positional stuff, I'll say this at the end of the day before guys leave. I've got barricades built at the 0 line, right beside the platform that we shoot prone or bench from. We can support your rifle from 6 inches off the ground up to 7 feet in 6-inch increments. And you've got to learn at certain heights off the ground, what do you do with your entire body to get that rifle to be still? Guys that live in the city, guys that live in an apartment, maybe a house, I'll always ask them, do you have a 6-foot step ladder, an A-frame style step ladder? Almost everyone does. And I've said, set it up in your backyard inside your privacy fence, shoot off the rungs of the ladder. Take a knee, sit down, stand up and lean on it. Aim at a knot on your privacy fence and just go click. Maybe you don't want your neighbors seeing it because people get a little nervous if you got a rifle in town. Sure. Well, then stay inside the house and do it.
Yeah.
There's one thing you can do for nothing at home is dry fire. Everybody that gets into this game is really valuable to do that. When I've got guys coming out for the day and we're finally about to check a 0 at 100-yard paper, I will tell them to dry fire. A lot of times they've never been prone. They've never laid down behind a rifle and shot prone. They've got to learn that respiratory cycle. Your non-firing hand is running the rear bag. If your stock is strong enough, the front end of the rifle is supported by a bipod. Dry fire is it's good to get your finger in tune with your eye and your brain. Get everything working together where you're not fighting anything. You should be comfortable. That's one thing you can do from now on. The other thing is I offer, obviously I've vetted these people that have come out and shot with me. I now know they're not crazy. They're not felons. They're going to be responsible and follow my range rules.
Sure.
I say, look, if you want to come shoot, just get in touch with me. You can come use my range. It's available for you. You just got to ask me as much time in advance notice as possible. can I come on a certain day? If I'm teaching someone else, the answer is going to be no. It's all private one-on-one. The only time I've had groups is when they come together. I encourage people to come out here and shoot at my range, and I've said, look, once a month. That's how you're going to get good at this, because my own personal training, fortunately, being on the land for all this time and having a range set up the entire time, my daily training at the end of the day evolved into a cold bore shot at distance, because and the term cold bore shot is you didn't check your zero, you didn't get a warm up, you maybe did not dry fire. Evolution into that cold bore shot at distance, that's the hunting shot. On a hunting shot, you don't get to have the time to dry fire. You don't get the time to check zero. You should have already done that. So just to challenge myself to make me get better at this, again, keeping good form, but reading the wind. It didn't matter if we had almost no wind or it was blowing 30 miles an hour. I was just seeing, can I hit that plate at 500 yards every time? And eventually I went to 600, then 7, then 8, making a cold bore shot at distance. But that's after years and years of every time I would go set up a range on that piece of property that I had usage of, or even here, trying to learn my rifle and ammo and scope combination. I recommend to everyone, your newer days to this, the next time you come back, if you're back out here in a month, if you're back out here in 3 months, start back over at zero. Check your 100-yard zero. Go to 200 yards, then 3, then 4, then 5. Walk yourself out from 100 out, doing dialing elevation. Then start over, start making holds with elevation. You're not going to get good at this unless you do it. And the saying goes, I did not come up with it, but I agree with it, is distance is science, wind is art. And that is what is the trickiest part of this, is correcting for wind, because those bullets do get drifted left and right because of crosswind, or head or tail for that matter. You've got to get out on the range a lot of days in a lot of weather before you're going to be comfortable with this. We always go down the dry erase board, and I let people know about temperature and density altitude. Those are both obviously weather measurements. In my part of Texas, just like so many others, I've documented -7 degrees, and I've documented 113 degrees outside on this same piece of property. When those temperatures swing that greatly, the air density swings with it. So that cold air, you've got a lot thicker gas. Your elevations change, your elevation corrections change as the weather changes. When you start talking beyond 500 yards, at least my stuff, my elevation corrections pretty much hold up in all weather out to 500. And beyond 500, I've got one rifle that I shoot a whole lot. After 500, I've got kind of a summertime dope chart, and I got a wintertime dope chart, because they're just not exactly identical. But I had to shoot it in that variation of weather to learn those things. So I offer this range for usage to come practice, to come dry fire, then go live round, shoot all the distances again, write down the temp and DA. You can get some pretty inexpensive instruments to tell you what the temp and DA are right where you're standing. You can get apps on your phone that will pull up the nearest NOAA weather station to wherever you are, which here it'd be probably within 20, 30 miles. It's probably gonna be close enough. I've got a handheld that tells me weather conditions. And throughout all the years of doing this and shooting in that variation of North Texas weather, as well as other states, I'll write down temperature, density, altitude. I'll write down the distance I shot, what elevation I dialed in or held, and what was the end result. I've got notes on every rifle that I own of the variation in my correction changes because of weather changes. And at the same time, I became better at shooting the rifle. So, there's a long story, but the end result for someone that, a good example I use is tying your shoes. You're now what is called, as an adult, you're now in the level of unconscious competence. You know how to tie your shoes so well because you started trying to do it when you were 5 years old or less. And now as an adult, you've been doing it for years. And I can put an adult in a room that's completely dark with their shoes right beside their feet, and they can put their shoes on and tie their laces correctly without even being able to see. They can feel it. Throwing a football or shooting a rifle is the same thing. More reps is what's going to get you better at this, because the truth is, any hunter, your heart rate's probably going to go up when that animal you're after is in front of you. And when that heart rate goes up and you get what's called the buck fever, have you built in the synapses in your brain to where you can still shoot well? And the only way to get there is a lot of rounds or dry fire time behind that rifle, especially the positional stuff. That's where I did most of my dry firing, was shooting positional. You know, I encountered a barricade at a rifle match in my earlier days that it kicked my butt. I just couldn't hardly get a hit off that thing because I've never been taught what to do with my entire body, with my feet, my knees, and my elbows, and my hands. Where do I grab the rifle with my non-firing hand? I wasn't taught that. And I had a buddy watch me, and then I went home and built an identical copy of that barricade because it caused me so much trouble. And I had it before I owned this land. I had it at home, and I just dry fire off of it. You know, the place I lived before here, it was 2 acres out in the county, but I'd aim at the top of the white tip of a T-post, and I'd dry fire off that barricade until I could get my body in the right position to get the rifle to be still. That's all it boils down to, is get the rifle to be still. So my barricades that are here, when we first start out and I'm telling people what to do with their body, I will tell them to go back to dry fire first. And there's a term called calling the shot. When you hear that firing pin click on a dry fire or right before a live round, was your scope where you wanted it to be on whatever it was you were trying to hit? Piece of paper, piece of steel, or an animal? Were you doing exactly right? Was your scope there where you wanted it when it fired? And I tell everyone, calling the shot is being honest with yourself and honest with me. Me as your spotter. If we're at 600 yards and I tell you to hold a mill right and you squeeze it off and it misses into the wind or downwind, then I'm thinking, well, I told them the wrong wind correction. It was my fault. But if you made a mistake, you've got to tell me you made that mistake. That's calling that shot. You can do the same thing dry firing. You know, when you're wobbling around and you're a little less than stable on the positional stuff, which is going to happen in the field hunting, can you get still enough to make that shot? And one thing that's very important on making the positional stuff is you don't want to be at high magnification on your rifle scope, because you'll what I call fight the wobble. You'll be swaying right to left, and then you overcorrect and go back too far to the right because your magnification is so high. So my earlier days, I might shoot the positional stuff at 8 power. And then later I was getting a little better at this and I'd go up to 10 power. Now I might go to 10 or 12, but I pretty much don't exceed that. Might have a 25 power rifle scope in front of me, but I'm not going to be up at 25 power shooting positional stuff.
Right. I
learned it for free via dry firing, you know. So that's what's really important to get proficient at this, is more time, getting more reps, whether they're dry fire or live round. And I've also said to everyone, you know, you're a professional, maybe you work weekdays and you've got a weekend scheduled that you want to come to the range, and you check with me on Monday, can I come Saturday? And I tell you yes. And then Saturday, the forecast is showing 30-mile-an-hour wind. Come anyway, because the only way to get good at shooting in the wind is to shoot in the wind. You've got to learn to make those holds. And, you know, when I've got people here for the day, and it happens, especially in the summer or spring and fall, they'll show up and we've got a south wind up here blowing 20 to 30 miles an hour. You know, the big 50-foot tall trees are swaying. You know, you can't set a piece of paper down, and it's just going crazy down range. And they'll look down that range and get intimidated immediately at how far the distances are than this big wind. And they go, oh my God, this is terrible. And I say to everyone, no, this is perfect. I want it this windy when you're here with me, because you will learn more. We're going to eventually get ourselves down range that you're holding off the target the right amount. You're aiming it at dirt next to the target, because I'm telling you your bullet's going to drift back over to it. So when you're coming out here on your own and the day you had scheduled is blowing really hard, you know, wind, come shoot. That's the best time to go shoot. There's days that I'm here and it is calm, like today's really calm. I'm not going to go shoot. I'm not going to. It's too easy. You know,
you've already done it.
You know, we had an April this year that we had 25 days of over 20-mile-an-hour wind. I shot all the time because it was windy. That's how you get good at this. And I'm never going to be perfect at this. You know, I'm just not. I've got to practice myself.
Yep. When you were mentioning scopes a minute ago and the variations of powers that you're shooting at, and you mentioned, like, you know, 4X or 8X or 12, and then, you know, there's some that go up, and I have one that goes up to 35 power. There's a lot of variations in scopes and styles. Can you just kind of talk to me a little bit about scopes and about the variations thereof?
there's a lot of optics makers now. There's some new ones. There's some old diehards. I've got some brands that I don't want any part of. I've got other brands that, because I've used them or because I've been beside people that's used them hard or they've been at my range, these brands have held up. They've done what they're supposed to do. But there's still choices out there that, you know, and that's why we've always got to have this conversation before someone comes to shoot with me. And I've got to ask, what kind of rifle scope do you have? And I'm not so worried about brand as much as the features in the scope. And, you know, there's some scopes out there that it seems to me that there's some optics companies out there that don't have any shooters working there because they've produced some optics that they almost got them right. But they didn't ask the guys that use these things constantly. And there's thousands of us across the country that shoot a whole lot. And, you know, you're coming out with some newfangled rifle scope and you almost got it right. You did a good job except for the reticle inside. You know, you did a good job except for, you know, the old days of the mill reticle and the MOA turret. That's foolish. There's no point in doing that. That's the way it was in the 80s and 90s. You know, that should have long gone away. The reticle that helps you hold wind correctly, the easiest way to shoot distance, the easiest way is to dial your elevation and hold wind. I do not dial wind. I don't touch that wind turret. My two Night Force attackers, the wind turret's covered. I'm not going to dial wind because it's a variable speed, variable angle. If you commit to dialing, you reach up, you dial. Now the Mirage tells you that you've got less wind. Are you going to reach up and dial again and take some wind out, or are you going to hold the difference? So you might as well just hold it all in the first place. The proper turrets that match the reticle. Having that reticle that works for holding wind correctly is very valuable. And holding elevation correctly. This precision rifle, and you start looking at rifle scopes that what Nikon came out with, BDC, bullet drop compensator, and there's lots of types of reticles out there that almost everyone makes. And those hold lines in the bottom are proximate, because if they're making this scope for a certain bullet at a certain muzzle velocity, and then you completely change cartridge, bullet, and muzzle velocity, well, now those holds are wrong. So the better plan is to go to a more universal type of scope. I prefer using mill-based scopes. Most of the guys that shoot the kind of move, shoot, precision rifle series style of shooting are running mills. And we could talk about that, the reason I prefer them, but they're still minute of angle. That's still out there. They're still produced. Most often manufacturers produce both. But your reticle is in whatever subtension. Is it broken up into mills? Is it broken up into MOA? And your turret match. Is it a turreted scope? Whatever you're seeing in your rifle scope, your turrets speak the same language. Obviously, we need good glass. There's certain makers out there that, is there better glass? Yes. But the company that makes the better glass, the internals in that scope aren't that reliable. They're built to be dialed into a 100-yard zero or 200-yard zero, whatever your preference, and not touched again because they just don't track well. Whereas when you get the right kind of scope with the mill or MOA-based reticle, this plays out at any distance, and it makes life so much easier on everyone. You know, and I've had guys, like I said, I've loaned them scopes. I've made recommendations on scopes. They purchased that scope and brought it with them, and then I teach them how to use that scope. That's a whole lot of the day, is how do we operate this rifle scope to everything that it's capable of doing. Even a 100-yard zero, you take a perfect shooting rifle, ammo, and shooter, you can zero 1 and 2 shots. You know, you do a bore sight, and I bore sight old school. I pull the bolt out, I look down the bore, and then I look up through the scope and crank in corrections and get it pretty close. And another thing that takes practice, I'm generally somewhere within about 10 inches of where I want it on the first shot. Go back and hold whatever you were aiming at 100-yard paper. Measure where the bullet hole is different. What is it right and left in mills or MOA? What is it up and down in mills or MOA from where you desired it to land? Dial in a correction with the turret that's speaking the same language. Your second shot should be on the money. That's the days of burning up 20-round box of ammo to get something zeroed should be long gone. And those scopes make that easier. Same thing downrange. My steel targets are painted white. They're against, this is called the Blackland Prairie, Texas. So there's black dirt behind those white targets. They stand out. They stand out very well. But when a bullet hits that steel, you can see your bullet mark as a circle, as a blank circle on that steel. And we're getting dope on something, whether I'm getting it for someone else's rifle or I'm spotting for someone for the day in the class. And, we're marching down range and you see your bullet mark 0.2 low on steel. Okay, come up 0.2 and fire another one. It should be in the middle. Same thing in 100-yard zero. It's the same case all the way out to any distance. So the reticle that's got a flat measurement and the turrets that speak the same. So when you're running the mil or MOA, I've said this to a lot of people. You could own a bolt action 22 long rifle, 10 cartridges in the middle, all the way up to 50 BMG, and use exactly the same scope on every single rifle. It's just a new set of numbers for every single cartridge, bullet ballistic coefficient, muzzle velocity that changes your trajectory. But that's a universal scope. Therefore, it'll match on every single cartridge out there. So that's what makes this easier.
And you were talking to me about that before, of the idea of having a Picatinny rail on top of each one of your rifle systems so that you could be able to unscrew the rings in your base and basically move those from one rifle to another, being able to then change, like you said, you might be able to just take 1 or 2 shots and you're back in zeroing. And I think that's something too that I'd like for you to talk about, because some people think I need a scope for every single one of my rifles, and that's just not the case anymore.
Not at all. The pick rail, I don't know how long it's been around, but once I bought my first one, that's what everything wears now.
Yep.
We need to add a photo from online somewhere of someone's Picatinny rail.
Oh yeah, we will.
Make this make sense. But the Picatinny rail it goes back to the pedigree of the Weaver style base, where you've got effectively a dovetail sticking up above your action. The pick rail's all over the AR-15 now. The forearms got pick rail all the way around it on some cases. And now there's mounts for flashlights and lasers and all kinds of things, but scope mounts are the same way. Every rifle I own, except for one, has a 20 MOA pick rail. So what that does is it raises the rear end of the scope up a little bit. That translates, if memory serves, about 5 mils extra. So that's giving me extra elevation travel to come up for a far shot. So everything's got a Picatinny rail on it. You can get you a Tikka CTR. It's going to come with one mounted on it. It's a 0 MOA base. But the key is the type of rings that connect to that, the kind that I use, are the kind that you've got a bolt that crosses that pick rail. It's inside the base at the bottom of the ring. The bolt crosses inside of a notch of the pick rail. On the other side is a clamp. Beyond the clamp is a nut. So now you're squeezing horizontally your scope ring to your pick rail. When I mount a scope and a set of rings for myself, that scope and those rings become one unit forever. That scope never leaves those rings. I put the scope in the rings. I get my eye relief set to fit my eye. By the way, you do that at maximum magnification. If you've got good sight picture, edge to edge clarity at maximum magnification, you're probably going to have it at any magnification. Get your eye relief set, then I'll level the scope, then I'll put my ring caps on. I'll use low strength Loctite on my screws. Whatever the manufacturer's torque spec is, I set my torque wrench to that. Very painstakingly tightening those screws, making sure that the ring caps and the rings are parallel with each other. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the old days of torquing a head down on an engine. There's a torque spec. There's a pattern you go in on tightening those bolts and certain torque specs. Sometimes you go half torque the first pass, then you come back a second pass at full torque. I actually do that on the ring. So if the ring manufacturer recommends 25 inch-pounds, I'll set my wrench at 12 on the first pass. Low strength Loctite will not weld those two pieces of metal together. You can take it apart later if you need it to, but it's not going to recoil itself apart. That's what happens to bad rings or improper torquing things down under recoil and handling the rifle. Maybe a tumble on a hunt. Oh crap, my scope took a hit on this rock out here. Something came loose. So let's just prevent that with good rings, torque down. Scope stays in those rings forever as long as I own that scope. I've got rifles in the safe that they're special tools for the job. The first time I did this, it was a big eye opener on a money saver. So when your standards become to a certain level of the type of rifle scope that you like, they're expensive, and you don't have to have that expensive level of a scope for every rifle, especially if you've got, in my case, I've got one that gets used almost all year long. It pretty much keeps the scope on it all the time. I've got two other rifles that are kind of special purpose. I've still got a 22-250 barrel on that one. That rifle pretty much gets used on the prairie dog towns in the Texas Panhandle 3 days a year. There's no point in it owning its own scope. That's too much money. So I've got a rental rifle, people that want to come shoot for the day. I've got a rifle they can rent with my ammo, and everyone loves shooting it. It's a really tight shooting rifle, doesn't recoil bad. I'll take that scope off that rental rifle and I'll stick it on the 22-250. If I've made that move before, I've got notes, and it says from 708 over to 22-250. Move windage this much, right or left. Move elevation this much, right or left. And the first year I did that on a Wednesday, I moved that scope to the 22-250 and zeroed it. Then zeroed out my turrets, and then shot out to distance, verifying the rifle and ammo run like I expected them to. And then we took off up to the Texas Panhandle, and the rifle got used hard for 3 days. And the following week I came back, I pulled that scope off that 22-250. I put it back on the rifle it came from. I checked the notes. I reversed the order, and I fired one shot, and I was done. So it becomes a modular system. Even my bolt action 22 long rifle is wearing a Picatinny rail. And when I might want a friend of mine wanted to run a rimfire match on my range, a long range rimfire match, and we actually went out to 250 yards with the 22 long rifles, and I tried to talk him into 300 yards. That's long range shooting for a 22 long rifle.
Oh yeah.
And I pulled a Night Force Attacker off of a center fire rifle and put it on that 22 and got made fun of by another shooter. And I said, we're shooting long range. Why would I not use the best scope I have?
Right.
So the Picatinny rail on every rifle, the kind that I like, are under $50. They always fit. Their screws are never stripped. They're made in America, and they're inexpensive, under $50. And it again, low strength Loctite, the pick rail down to the action. Maybe before you pull the rifle out of the safe, make sure they're still tight. Make sure the pick rail is still tight to the rifle. Move your scope over. I get it. I have 2 rifle ranges in my front yard, and I can check zero really easily. But for someone that has to go use a range, I do recommend you do go shoot it. Make sure that your zero did in fact go where you told it to. Take the time to just at least go check your zero at least 100-yard range somewhere. But once you've made the move one time, it should be repeatable. And that's just a really nice modular system. And again, I don't have QD mounts. You got to have a 1/2-inch socket to take those rings and scope as one unit off the pick rail. But that's not too hard to obtain. I've actually used a crescent wrench before to move a scope, because that's all I had nearby was to back off those 1/2-inch hex nuts and move the scope to another rifle and tighten them back down. But really it becomes a money saver. If you do have 3 to 10 rifles, and this year you bought a really expensive scope, and it's going to be a few years before you can afford to do it again, move that thing around and take notes from moving from one to the next, and you get to keep using the same really good scope on multiple rifles for multiple occasions.
Absolutely.
That's where some people, including myself, you kind of go a little tight on the budget at first, and maybe the thing worked, maybe it didn't. All of us have the stories of we bought the wrong thing and didn't know it. And then someone that knows a lot about this topic can tell you the right thing to buy, and you get the right thing after you sold the wrong thing and lost money on the wrong thing. And then you get into, a nicer rifle scope and you love it. And that's what creates that, my standards have just become higher. I can't go back to this lower end scope because it can't do the same things as this one that I really enjoy using.
Absolutely. And I've learned from you, I've learned from other people, and you got to have an open mind and open ears and open eyes, because there's so much you can learn these days. There's mass amounts of information, and there's some people who don't know what they're talking about, but they maybe have a big platform, and so people listen to them. But there's enough wisdom out there that you can really search it out and be able to figure out, what is good equipment, what are some good tips and tricks and things. And the thing that I learned, that I now, as gifts that I've given to each one of my friends and they come over to hunt with me, is a simple little notepad. I get these little tiny pins that you can get online, and they'll fit inside the little metal rings in the top of the notepad. And I'm like, put this in your backpack. Or, for what I do now too, is I got a stock pack that you had recommended. It's got a zipper on the side, and I keep that in there. And each one of my rifles has that. And I'm writing out whenever I'm actually, what is the date that I'm shooting? What's the temperature? What are the range conditions? Is there wind? And I'm going to be going, because I remember when you built the rifle for me, you had it doped out to 800 yards at 100-yard increments. What is each elevation dial? What's the difference? Well, when I went back to my ranch in South Texas from North Texas, there's a little bit of distance there, and it was different weather when I was out there, and it changed ever so slightly, but I was able to then be able to plug in, and then that way I know X months down the road, if I'm in this particular weather, now I know I can look at my notes and this is probably what it's going to be. And it's that data, or it's that data on previous experience, right? Like, I'm taking the notes so that I'm actually becoming more proficient just from the data. And it's not hard. It's very simple. Take notes. And, I have friends that each time that there's things that, got a buddy of mine who was shooting at deer, and there was times where he was injuring them. And I was like, what is going on? Like, on the range, he's, hitting bullseye. And so I said, I need to take this one more step further. And in Texas, there's a lot of box blinds people shoot out of, right? It's different than in the West, where you're walking through and you're coming up and down mountains. A lot of times in Texas and in this region, you're sitting up in box blinds, or, different kinds of stands, whatever you want to call them. And I wanted to see, I was like, show me exactly how you're lining up on your shot. And I had failed him by not going up and watching how he sets up for that shot, because it's different than just sitting down at a bench and what you're doing. Or, like you're saying too, if like, you're having people shoot prone, being able to have that repeatable performance, right? Well, he hadn't practiced in this particular deer blind and this particular angle at this, game trail that runs through. And there were certain things I saw. I was like, oh, one, you're resting your barrel on the stand. No, we're going to rest on the stock, because there's, we can talk about it too, like barrel harmonics and there's different pressure pressure points on your barrel. And then two, I was like, look, you're kind of in a frame window. Why not put your stock right on the edges of the frame, so you have more points of contact and that you're able to hold it steadier? Going up there and just making a few suggestions, he's center punching the heart every single time on the shot. And, because also every time that you're out there, like you were talking about too, that adrenaline gets going, right? You got the buck fever. Eliminate the variables. Do all the things to where you can be able to repeat your performance in the best way. And some of that is, now I got a buddy, Matthew Mitchell, who co-hosts a lot of these podcasts. His first thing he does is, whenever he gets in a deer blind, is he's going to get his rifle out and he's going to check each window and figure out the best way to where he can position himself to move as stealth as possible, to be able to get in the position to where he's got the best hold on his rifle, to make sure that he's making the most ethical shot. And, that kind of thing that I think is super important. Like, really that the data that you can put together, all the notes that you can keep, because you can be able to create that data bank of information, and you don't eventually have to rely on someone else. You're relying on your own performance and that experience. And that's where you can kind of build up to, if you're shooting at targets, or if it's at animals, you can extend your range. And, I'm curious, speaking about extending that range, I'm sure, I heard you mention the 800 yards and then 1,000. I know you've shot some matches that are further out. What is your longest shot? And walk me through how you got to that. And I'm curious, what is that? What's the longest shot that you've hit on a target?
I was taking notes on your run there.
Yeah.
Your note taking, your buddy's note taking, that's exactly the right thing to do. I learned it from others, and this actually goes back to military snipers. They would write down what the weather conditions were, what elevation, they dialed for certain distance, and started learning about, with ammo that they're not creating, they're not running hand loaded stuff. U.S. Army Marksmanship Unit does, as far as I know. Every rifle has a hand load made for it by some soldiers that, and those guys typically win. Those, they'll win Wimbledon and a lot of F class, and they're squared away for sure. But in my case, with my hand loads, what's the weather doing to my bullet flight? What's it doing on my elevation up and down? And really, I don't really take a lot of notes anymore about wind, because wind is so subjective, and you just got to have a lot of practice at it. But the note taking on weather changes, and again, back to temperature and density altitude, which is, a blend of barometric pressure and temp, and this came from pilots. How dense is this air? What temperature is it? And you start to see patterns. You will start to see that, man, in December, it was 30 degrees when I was shooting, and my elevation at 400 yards was the same in May. So I just didn't have a change, and that's good news. For most hunters, you're probably not shooting game farther than that. But once you start punching out what NRA refers long range as 600 plus, yeah, you potentially could start having some elevation changes in your trajectory. And it, like I said, it's kind of old school of keeping notes. And one guy that I don't know him, I can't tell you his name. I just saw him at a rifle match, and you've got so many shooters out there holding a Kestrel weather meter with a ballistics program built into it, which is a really fine machine. And I saw this guy walk up to someone else with a Kestrel, and he said, "Hey man, what's the density altitude?" He had a mercury thermometer hanging off of his backpack. He knew what the temp was, but he just asked someone, "What's the density altitude?" And this other person told him what the density altitude was, and he said, "Okay, thank you." And he goes over his pack, and I see him pull out laminated cards, and the laminated cards were in density altitude 1,000 foot increments. Well, he just flipped over to the laminated card that was the closest to the density altitude we were shooting in, and went and made it happen. I mean, that guy he wasn't missing because of that at all. He did just fine, because he had shot that rifle in so many variations of weather and took notes, and then finally compiled it on a computer, printed it out really cleanly, and laminated it. He didn't need a $700 instrument. He just needed to know what's the DA, and I can go make this happen. And he did just fine. So that's really old school, but it still works, taking those notes. Resting the barrel is always bad. You talked about him resting that barrel. You really helped him out. That is always terrible. Like I said, you want that barrel to be free floated out of the stock. You certainly don't want it touching a fixed object ever. It's going to change the harmonics of that barrel. Every rifle barrel flexes in a sine wave. They all do it. The longer, the thinner the barrel, the more pronounced that sine wave is going to be. That's also the type of rifle that's going to have a much narrower window of proper powder charge, where the one below didn't shoot great, then I find one that shoots great, then I go even hotter and it's not shooting great again. So it's got a really narrow, what's called the node. That's the powder charge node. That's the one that's going to be a very narrow node, and you're playing on the flex of the barrel, which cannot touch anything. You do the short, heavy barrel with a moderate cartridge, and the node's going to be very wide. It's going to shoot a lot of different powder charges very well, because it's not flexing as much. Checking each shooting position you brought up in his blind, 100% correct. I don't shoot from blinds very often. But I would have done exactly the same thing, because when you're setting up somewhere on an ambush style hunt, whether it's in a blind or out in the field, you've got to be thinking, what if this animal shows up at my 3 o'clock? What if it shows up at 12? What if it shows up at my 9 o'clock? What am I going to do to move to get in position to get that shot and not get busted? What I mean by getting busted, for those that don't know, so many things out there, obviously they're using their sense of smell very well, but their eyes also. Animals are looking for movement. As a hunter, that's what you look for, is you're looking for movement. whether you're predator hunting or game hunting for something you're going to eat. Whitetail will spot you if you move quickly. You know, they'll see you if you're close enough to them. So you've got to move very slowly and deliberately to not get busted to where they take off. And I agree with him. I usually am on the ground somewhere. I kind of, whatever the wind's doing, wherever the sunlight's doing, that's might be where I set up somewhere and get ready to hopefully shoot a whitetail doe to put in the freezer or whatever it may be. Even coyotes, you've really got to hide from coyotes. They're brilliant animals. My opinion, they're the smartest thing walking in Texas. You know, their eyes, nose, ears, they're everything. And you can easily get busted by a coyote and it is going to take off. So what if it shows up at multiple angles from where you're shooting? Can you get there to make a shot? Absolutely right. I completely agree. Longest shot. So like I said, my earlier days, you know, years ago, it was a big deal. First time I hit 1,000 yards, and it was on private property. I was out there by myself. And I figured it out. Oh my God, I can't believe I finally got here. You know, that's a milestone for anyone. That's a long way.
Sure is.
A half mile is 880 yards. And once you kind of get, you know, like I've told everybody that's come and shot with me, once you figure out how to put all this together on my range, 800 yards, it's the same information to go twice as far. It's the same skill set, the same. Plug in your ballistics calculator, get it trued. You know, we probably need to talk about that a little bit later. And what you do to make the shot from 100 to 800 is you're doing really the same things to go farther out. So, you know, then eventually it was a milestone when I took my 7 Rim Mag hunting rifle that will tolerate 3 rounds in a row before it's too hot. I was on a buddy's deer lease, and he's a shooter, and his other leasee was there. We're there in the off season hog hunting. They had steel set out to 1,760 yards, which is a mile. And I hit that mark. I splashed my first one low, but did get a second round hit and was able to repeat it. So I got to 1,760, and that was my record for years, personal record. Then later, last year, I decided to not try to use a hunting rifle to shoot that kind of distance. I wanted something that was built to target shoot really, really far. What is, I think, an unofficial term is extreme long range is beyond 1,000 yards. That at least a lot of people use it that way. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to put together something that was built to go shoot distance. And I'm not gonna attempt the series, the matches of they call it the King of 2 miles. That, you know, there's been some world records set several times in the last couple of years, especially. They've got a really good organization going. I've never been to that match. I've never been there personally. I've just seen the results and some footage and some photos, and that's not something I really want to pour the money into, is going 2 miles. But I wanted something that was built for a mile plus. So what is a smart thing to do for any rifle, for any job, is you start with the bullet. What bullet is going to be good for this job? You know, whether it's varmint hunting or big game hunting or long range target with high round count, or in my case, in this particular project, what's going to be a good ELR bullet? Well, Hornady released their A-tip a couple of years ago, aluminum tip bullet. Really big, really heavy, high BC bullet. For years, Berger was the king of ballistic coefficient, and I like Berger bullets a whole lot. Hornady's challenged them. They have been for a while now. Hornady said, "Well, we'll just see about that." So they keep innovating, which is good for us as consumers. That, you know, when these manufacturers are competing against each other, we get the benefit of that.
Absolutely.
And Hornady said, "Well, we'll just see about that." You know, and they started upping their game. And when they introduced the 30 caliber 250 grain A-tip, me and some friends said, well, we got to figure out what cartridge to make it run. What's going to be a good cartridge to drive this bullet? And there's a lot of options. And, you know, when you start talking anything downrange, ballistic coefficient, muzzle velocity, and some bullet weight are what's important on what you're going to get downrange. So some friends of mine and I, we went to pouring over all of the options, even some custom-made reamers for some, you know, kind of wildcat cartridges was going to be an option. And then finally, two of us were having a discussion, and he hung up the phone, and 10 minutes later, he called me right back. He said, look at the 300 Norma mag. I said, yeah. He said, I think it's going to be a good option. He said, you know, the 338 Norma mag Norma went into that years ago. I think, I don't know what year, but it's not 40 years old. They were trying to improve the 338 Lapua mag, trying to make a more efficient case geometry. And then it wasn't long after it was wildcatted into 30 caliber. So it was, you know, the same shape of brass all the way up to what's called the neck shoulder junction. You know, if you're coming from case head up, you go up to the datum line, which is where you make the turn to make the shoulder of a piece of brass. Then you make the turn vertical again. That's the neck shoulder junction. So from the neck shoulder junction up, it's no longer 338, it's 30 cal. So, you know, I start looking at load data, and there was no load data for a 250 grain bullet because the bullet's too new. Previously, I think the heaviest we had available was a 225 30 caliber. There was load data for that. But I'm looking at case capacity. You know, they'll list it water capacity, which is not going to translate into powder capacity. It's going to be close. And you start looking at water capacity of different cartridges, and that one looked really good. And, you know, you start talking about shoulder angle of different cartridges where you create efficiency. The 6.5 Creedmoor and the 260 Remington, I can make them produce identical ballistics once they leave the muzzle. I can get a 140 grain coming out at 2800 and it's safe. But the 260 is going to need another grain of powder to make it happen because the 6.5 Creedmoor case geometry is more efficient. So the 300 Norma mag looked to be built into an efficient burn cartridge. So we picked our bullet, we picked our cartridge, and I called Southern Precision Rifles. Their website's bugholes.com. They build rifles, they sell barrels, they sell actions. They're great people there. The two guys that will answer the phone are great guys. And I called up Greg and I said, hey, I saw on your website you've got a 30 caliber and a 9 twist. He goes, yeah. He said, what are you doing? I said, a 250 A-tip past a mile. He goes, man, I don't know if it'll stabilize it or not. And he said, I have an 8 twist 30 cal. I said, really? That's extremely aggressive twist, but it might be necessary. I said, let me call Hornady. So Hornady Technical Support, I've called them 3 times over the years. Those guys are shooters. They'll talk to you. They'll sit there and visit with you all you want. They're helpful. Yep. I had another guy ask me the G7 ballistic coefficient on the Hornady 50 caliber 750 grain AMAX, and it wasn't published. I called Hornady and asked him, what's the G7? He goes, we don't have that published? Well, let me find out. Let me call the guys in engineering and find out the G7 for you. But in this conversation, I called him up and I said, okay, got technical support. I said, your new 250 grain A-tip 30 caliber. What twist does it really need? And he said, what are you doing? I said, past a mile. He goes, well, a 9 would be okay, but an 8 would probably help you. I said, I understand. So that's where you get into the term called gyroscopic stability. You want your bullet to still be drilling a hole like a drill bit instead of wobbling like that football we talked about earlier. You know, the professional NFL quarterback, you know, that's trying to throw a football 100 yards, and at the end of that throw, that football starts to wobble on its nose. A bullet will do the same thing. So you've got to twist it hard enough to maintain that gyroscopic stability downrange. So Hornady said the 9 would be marginal, but the 8 would most likely be the real answer. Thank you. That's exactly what I needed to know. I called back to Greg. I said, Hornady's saying I'd be better off with an 8 twist. He said, I have it. He said, what kind of contour do you want? Well, I had been sitting on a stock that I bought from an individual over a year ago, and it was inletted for a really heavy-duty contour, which is what I wanted. I wanted this rifle to be heavy because it's going to be burning a lot of powder with a lot of bullet, which would equate to recoil. I'm not carrying it around hunting with it, so I wanted it heavy. Right. And I told him the contour I needed. He said, I have it. And he said, it's here available if you like the length. I said, how long is it? He said, 31 inches. I said, charge my card, send it to me. So here it came. Well, then I got it to the guy that runs the lathe and chambered it in 300 Norma mag, and then I had no load data to reference. There was no load data for my choice of powder with this bullet in this cartridge. So it's like, well, okay, let's just go experiment. That's what I'm doing, is experimenting and taking notes as I go. And it'd be a long tale to talk about a ladder test, but I ladder tested this thing at 700 yards to find out where in the powder charge range should I be. And I learned what I needed to on the ladder, then shot groups. And quite frankly, it's a waste of components on my range. It's not a long enough range to justify shooting such a big, heavy, powerful cartridge. You're wasting money on loading components. But I shot it at 6, 7, and 800 yard paper or steel and stopped because it also hits really hard. It'll tear them up really. And it's set still. Well, then a friend of mine's dad has a ranch up in Oklahoma we can see far. He's got some fence lines that we can get lines of sight really far. So it'd been months, and we running around the ranch and lasering things, and because we just like to go play shooting distance, just not looking for glory. It's just fun,
Yeah.
And we found a spot that we could get a sure enough mile out of along a fence line, and we set a piece of steel up, lasered to where we were going to shoot. It was 1440 yards, and he was behind me on glass. I laid down behind it. It was windy that day, and he said, what are you going to do for a wind hold? I said, I'm going to start with a 10 mile an hour hold. I was expecting to hit the dirt, because my wind hold is wrong. I'm going to be right or left of this piece of steel. I hit it on the first shot, 1444 yards. And we're kind of hooping and hollering. And he said, you got to be kidding me. I said, you saw it. You're my witness. It happened. I said, that's a personal farthest cold bore hit right there. And I said, come over here and shoot this thing. So he got behind it and he shot it also. Well, then we backed up even farther, and we backed up to exactly 1760. And I did miss my first round. I was holding into the wind a little too much, and then hit it on the second round. I was actually a 10th mil low, brought it up a 10th mil, and then handed it, let him get down behind it for him to shoot it as well. It's big, it's loud. There's a lot of muzzle blast comes off the sides of the break, but man, it's fun. And then months go by, I haven't shot the rifle. I took it to a place that I get to go hunt. It's a big ranch in Sanderson, Texas. You can see really far out there. And we set up a piece of steel in the bottom of Sanderson Canyon, which Highway 90 runs right through it. It's massive, but the ranch is on there. And we took the road up top, and we drove and looked back, and I said, it's not far enough yet. So we drove some more. And then we've got to find a place where we can get set up and actually get line of sight from us to the target. I did not at the time have a laser to reach that far. So, there's a technique of milling with your reticle. You're measuring. If you know the size of the target, you put a mill reticle or MOA, you can do some math and determine how far it is. And there's the high potential for error right there. And I was way wrong. I milled it. I was a fraction of a tenth of a mil or 0.05 mil wrong. And I came up with I don't even remember how far. Pulled up my ballistics calculator, dialed the correction it told me to. A friend of mine sitting behind me on spot and scope, and fired that shot. Waited and waited. Finally saw my bullet hit the dirt, and dialed up a correction. Fired the second one, hit the dirt on the second one because we just did not know how far this thing was.
Yeah.
Third round, did hit it, and then hit it again. And then hit it a third time. When you're working things backward, you got ballistic coefficient, muzzle velocity, bullet weight, sight height, all that plugged into your ballistics calculator, and it's giving you good information. So I had good information to 1,760 yards. So I've got to believe that it's true. It's the calculator is giving me back good information. So via that, it said I was shooting 2,180 yards. So basically a mile and a quarter. And if memory serves, from muzzle to target, that bullet took 3.3 seconds to get there, which seems like an eternity. It's leaving the barrel at Mach 2 times the speed of sound, and it took it that long to get out there. That's why that buddy that was spotting behind me, when I did hit it that first round, he went, "Oh my God!" I said, "We're shooting really far here." Yeah, that is absolutely for sure. We're shooting far, and it's just for fun. That's just because I like to shoot a rifle, and you start trying to push yourself and challenge yourself. That's a lot of fun, Would I shoot a hog with it? Absolutely. It'll probably cut it in half, but
we're going to cook one half of this. We don't know which half yet.
One half of the hog, because the other half got destroyed. and we talked about earlier about truing your calculator. There's apps, there's handheld calculators. All of them go off of the same parameters. There's online ballistic calculators, ballistics.com. It's free. They give you good information. What they're all going to ask for, when you're wanting to know predicted trajectory, it's not dope. People think it is. The only way to get dope is to physically shoot it and write it down. But this is predicting your trajectory. You tell it caliber, bullet weight, muzzle velocity, ballistic coefficient. The manufacturer that made the bullet will tell you a ballistic coefficient. Most manufacturers are telling the truth. There's one that typically inflates their stuff. Plug those in, your twist rate, your muzzle velocity, your sight height. Sight height is the distance from the center of the bore up to the center of the scope. Most things out there are between 1 3/4 to 2 1/8, somewhere in there. It's going to ask for it in decimal, so you may punch in 2.00, 2.1, what have you. You plug in all those parameters and all these options ballistic calculators. Are you in mils or are you in MOA? You tell it which one you want to give you a trajectory corrections. Then you hit calculate. Then it spits out numbers at any distance you ask for. What's your elevation correction? What's your wind drift? And I start with a 5 mile an hour wind at 3 or 9 o'clock from the shot. So that's a wind pushing 3 o'clock into my shot or 9 o'clock. That's what I plug in for wind at 5 miles an hour and build from there. And whenever your calculator and your dope don't match, the way to true it typically on a range my length is adjust muzzle velocity. Even if you've got a chronograph giving you muzzle velocity, something's not jiving. So you may have to go in there and go, man, it's just my dope and the calculator's not matching up out here at 800 yards. And I had that right before a match. I had 2,800 feet per second plugged in for this bullet. I had calculated notes. I shot it, and I needed to come up a little bit more, like a 1/10 mil more at 600, 700, 800 yards. So my calculator wasn't trued. So I went in my calculator and I dropped the speed that I plugged in, either 20 or 25 feet per second. And then now my calculator matches my dope. So I trued my calculator. So that's important, especially if you're shooting competitively, if you're shooting for money against buddies, if you're shooting a rifle match and you change locations, and now you've got a new temperature and density altitude or more distance than you had available to true your calculator, like in my case, 800s as far as I could go at home, it'll give you good information on a shot you've never taken. So in my case, that 1444, I had never taken a shot that far with that rifle. But I asked my calculator, what's my elevation? And it told me, and I dialed it, and it was correct. So that's where you true your calculator, even for a hunting rifle. The other thing is I tell everyone that comes out, I am not trying to make people 800-yard deer killers. That's not my goal. Once you learn what it takes with the machinery and you as a shooter to go 800, by the end of the day, I ask everybody, now how does 400 feel?
Easy.
Once you've been to 8, now how does 400 feel? I get the same answer from everyone every time. They say it feels like a chip shot.
Yep.
And they've also I've made them shoot positional, kneeling, seated, standing. I've told them we're going to shoot my biggest steel at 300 and 400 yards. And I've had them shoot positional at 300 and 400. So basically, I want them leaving not afraid of out to 400 yards anymore. You know what to do to go to 8, but most hunting shots are taken inside 300.
Sure.
Now you should have extremely high level of confidence to make that 300-yard shot or 400-yard shot. I know what can go wrong shooting an animal beyond 400. If I'm wrong about wind, if it takes a step, you got that flight time involved. I went for years never needing to shoot a game animal at long range. I have now, but I wasn't trying to. But I went in the field prepared to do it in case I had to.
Mm-hmm. It's all about that preparation. It's about the data, getting the right information that we all have, you have access to. And I feel like more and more people are going to increase their own abilities by studying these things, by taking a course such as yours, by really learning what their tool is that they're working with. And I think, I highly encourage anybody who is ready to take their, shooting to the next level. Definitely if you're here in Texas, we've got the guy to go to, and that's coming to you, and it sounds like, you got some folks that are coming in from other states too. So if you're ready to travel and you want to have some Texas barbecue while you're here, come on down and definitely give Jason a call. I would love for you to tell people where they can get a hold of you, how they can find out more about your rifle classes, your reloading, your custom rifle building. What's the best spot for them to find you?
You can email me, you can call me, you can text me. There's multiple avenues to get in touch with me. I do get phone calls from just random people constantly, because you do some work for someone, you do a good job for them, and they've got friends and family that say, hey, here's the problem I got. And it's kind of funny that myself and a lot of friends that what we talk about when a topic comes up is that, I don't know everything, my buddies don't know everything, but if a topic comes up you don't know about, hopefully you can say, I know a guy. Yeah. That's what you hope to achieve later in life is, whenever I was building my house, I called my buddy up and I go, I need a plumber. He goes, I know a guy. Here's his phone number. Well, that sometimes happens with me. I get someone call me and he's got to open. I need him to open with, hey, so-and-so, you did some work for, and he gave me your number. Okay, what can I do for you? We'll move on from there. Right. And, sometimes I just need my scope mounted zeroed. Sometimes it's, man, I want some really good ammo. Sometimes it's, he told me you taught him how to shoot distance, and it was a great day. And he got out of his bad habits and developed new habits and learned how to do new things. And I want to come out.
Cool. And you have a website that has some.
That's correct.
Yep. And that is precisionriflehunters.com.
That's correct. And I really need to update that thing. I've failed to update it. Hopefully it's explaining what I'm doing out here. It's been basically, I knew how much trouble I had and how much trouble friends of mine, I've heard stories about, guys that are hand loaders, they know what they're doing. And you sit at home and you create some test loads, you create some fowlers, you create some test loads, and you work for a living, and you scheduled Saturday to go to some range somewhere and set up and shoot your shots and document your findings and learn what you need to learn. And okay, well, I need to refine this load. And so they go back home, they pack their stuff up, they go back home. And maybe the next weekend they're back out again at that range and they're refining their load. And maybe they figure out the best load on that second trip. Sometimes I've seen it take 3, and the guys are tweaking stuff. And then they finally figure out their right recipe for their ammo. Well, now they want to start shooting distance. Well, now you have really reduced your choices on ranges available really in America of where steel is set up that's available to get dope, to shoot distance. There's just not that many places around, including for me years ago. I had to set up and take down before I'd go back home. I couldn't leave my targets out there in that field on borrowed land, I had permission on. Right. And before you know it, a load development and getting dope, it's a month or more. And, that's the people that are responsible, and there's plenty of them out there. They maybe they do know what they're doing shooting distance, but they've got this new rifle and maybe they're also a hand loader. I've worked for guys that are hand loaders. They've brought me their components and their rifle, and I've found their recipe and given it all back to them, and then they go home and make their ammo. That's completely fine because I've got the facility and I know how to do it. So, there's been hand loaders that I will actually, just because I know that this can be a thing, my scale and his scale might not read identical, but I know what the powder charge was on my scale. So one of his pieces of brass that's fired now, that's still holding its primer, I will dump my powder charge into his fired brass and put a piece of tape over the case mouth so that he can take it home, dump it in his pan, sitting on his scale, and verify are both of our scales reading the same. Maybe his scale reading the 10th grain lighter or heavier. Well, he can still recreate the exact same powder charge that I found. Yep. So the tail of the load development, getting zeroed to it, then get dope on it at distance for someone that shoots competitively or hunting, and they're comfortable shooting at 400 plus, but they're trying to get prepared and get dope on it and physically shoot it. it's a lot of time involved, and not everyone has that, and they don't have the availability to go to a place, and even me included. It turns into a lot of driving to go to somewhere where it's set up to do all of these things.
Oh yeah.
So, I decided to buy some land and build a place where you could shortcut all of this, and a rifle that's dropped off for me to make some ammo for, and they're all rifles people hunt with. Every one of them, these guys are hunting with it. If their scope's capable, I will find the load, zero to it, and then I'll run it out to 800 yards. I'll document your elevation corrections. I'll write down your 5-mile-an-hour wind hold, and I will write down the temp and density altitude when I shot it. And that's about a day, maybe less. So I just took what used to take me even a month, and I've now got it down to a day. So that's helping people go out in the field with good equipment that's going to work and do the same thing every time.
Well, and I know that you do it well. You've made me a better shooter. You've helped me get my equipment where it needs to be, to where I feel fully confident in any of my abilities now and what I'm doing. And it's kind of trickled down. I'm doing it with my friends' rifles, teaching them. They're learning about it too. And we're all having a better understanding of what our tools do and how to use them the most effective way and in the most ethical way. And for that, I am extremely grateful. And thank you for taking the time to come here today and talk about all this. As usual, I'm going to be sending some folks your way, and I'll leave all the information here where they can reach out to you, and if they have any questions or they're looking for your services. And thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun today. Looking forward to everyone's response and doing this again sometime with you. Well,
thank you for having me. I'm really honored that you asked me to come be part of this. I really appreciate that. And yes, hopefully we get some positive feedback and someone going, this is what I needed help with. And now I know who to call to help with it. So thank you for having me.
Cool, man. Well, you have a great afternoon. We'll talk soon, buddy.
Okay. You as well.
Take care.